Shirley Pierce had always stood for fairness. As a Supreme Court judge, she dedicated her life to making sure the law was upheld with integrity, that those without power were given a voice, and that individuals who misuse their authority face consequences. But she never imagined that one day she would return home to find her own son, Jake, unable to leave their house because of a reckless decision made by a group of overconfident bureaucrats. That morning had begun just like any other. She had hurried out the door, balancing her briefcase in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, focused on the long list of cases awaiting her at work. Her schedule was packed, her day structured down to the minute, just as it had been for years. But as soon as she pulled into her driveway that evening, she knew something was wrong. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Normally, Jake would be outside, rolling down the ramp, excited to greet her after a long day. Instead, he was nowhere in sight. Frowning, she stepped out of her car and approached the front of the house, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape, until she stopped cold. The ramp was gone. Not damaged, not under construction, completely gone, as if it had never existed. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind raced. This couldn't be real. There had been no warnings, no notices, no discussions about any issues with the ramp. It had been there that morning, the very structure her son relied on to enter and exit their home, and now it was nothing but an empty space. A spark of fear ignited in her chest as she rushed to the front door and yanked it open, calling for Jake. His voice came from inside, frustration and helplessness clear in his tone. He was stuck. Without the ramp, he had no way to leave the house on his own. Shirley's pulse pounded as she tried to process the reality of the situation. Who would do this? Who would remove a critical accessibility feature without so much as a warning? Then, as her gaze dropped to the envelope taped to the door, she felt her anger flare. It was a notice from the HOA. Bold, cold, impersonal. According to the letter, the ramp had been deemed a violation of the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines and had been removed to preserve the community's visual harmony. As if her son's independence was nothing more than an inconvenience, an eyesore that disrupted the neighborhood's so-called perfect image. Her hands clenched in a fist as she read the words again, as if staring at them long enough would make them make sense. But they didn't. There was nothing reasonable about what had just happened. This wasn't just a violation of common sense. It was a direct attack on her son's right to exist in his own home, and the HOA thought they could get away with it. Shirley had spent years defending others in the courtroom, but now it was personal. Every case she had ever fought had been about justice, about ensuring that laws were not just words on paper, but protections for the people who needed them most. But this time, it was not about clients, legal arguments, or precedents. This was about her son. This was about an abuse of power that directly impacted her family, and she was not going to let it slide. With steady hands, she pulled out her phone and took photos of the notice, the empty space where the ramp once stood, and every possible angle that could serve as evidence. This was not going to be a simple battle of words. It was going to be a legal war, and she was going to make sure the HOA never forgot the mistake they had made. The first step was gathering all the legal documentation. She pulled out the original permits, the medical necessity letters, and the city's approval, all of which had allowed the ramp to be built in the first place. Every piece of paperwork was in order. Every requirement had been met. There was no loophole, no fine print, no reason for this to have happened other than a blatant disregard for her son's needs. She wasn't just angry, she was outraged. It had taken months to get that ramp installed, ensuring it was compliant with every regulation, and yet the HOA had removed it as if it was nothing more than an unsightly decoration. Her next move was to call the HOA office, demanding an explanation. The phone rang 3 times before a receptionist picked up, her voice neutral and indifferent. When Shirley introduced herself and stated the reason for her call, there was a moment of hesitation before she was told that the HOA president would need to address the matter personally. That was not acceptable. She insisted on speaking to someone immediately, but the receptionist repeated the same rehearsed line, saying that a written complaint could be submitted and reviewed at the next board meeting. As if this was just another minor dispute, as if a child's mobility had not just been taken away in an instant. Frustration burned in her chest as she ended the call. If they thought she was going to sit back and wait for some routine meeting, they were sorely mistaken. She was going to take action, and it was going to happen now. She opened her laptop and started typing, drafting legal notices, documenting every violation the HOA had committed, and preparing to take them to court if necessary. They had pushed the wrong person. The first person she needed to confront was the HOA president. Shirley had dealt with difficult people throughout her career, but there was something particularly infuriating about power-hungry individuals who believed they were untouchable simply because they held a title. She knew that the president, Margaret Caldwell, had been running the HOA like a personal empire for years, issuing fines over the smallest infractions and making life miserable for anyone who dared to question her authority. If Margaret thought she could bulldoze over Shirley's family the way she had done with others, she was about to get a harsh reality check. With her evidence folder tucked under her arm, Shirley marched to the HOA office, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked with unwavering determination. The receptionist barely had time to react before Shirley pushed open the door and stepped inside. "I need to speak with Margaret Caldwell," she stated firmly, her tone making it clear that she was not asking. The receptionist hesitated before stammering that Margaret was in a meeting, but Shirley was in no mood for games. She met the woman's gaze and said in a calm but undeniable voice that she would wait right there until the meeting was over. Whether it took 5 minutes or 5 hours, she was not leaving until Margaret answered for what had happened. It only took 2 minutes for the receptionist to cave and disappear into the back office. Moments later, the door swung open, and Margaret stepped out, her expression composed but her eyes carrying a flicker of annoyance. "Shirley, what a surprise," she said smoothly, though there was nothing welcoming in her voice. "I assume this is about the ramp?" Shirley didn't waste time with pleasantries. She pulled out the paperwork and placed it on the desk between them. The ramp was approved, legally permitted, and medically necessary. The HOA had no right to remove it. Margaret barely glanced at the documents before offering a rehearsed response, claiming that the ramp had been taken down due to noncompliance with neighborhood standards. "It disrupts the uniform aesthetic of the community," she added with a dismissive wave of her hand. Shirley's patience was razor-thin. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and controlled. "You removed an accessibility feature without notice, without warning, and without cause. That is not only unethical, but it is also illegal." Margaret's expression didn't falter, but Shirley could tell she had struck a nerve. This was the kind of person who thrived on intimidation, expecting others to back down. But Shirley wasn't just anyone. She was a Supreme Court judge, and she knew the law better than Margaret ever could. When Margaret attempted to brush off her concerns with another excuse, Shirley cut her off. "You will reinstate that ramp immediately," she stated. "If you do not, I will take legal action. This is not a threat. It is a promise." Margaret's face darkened slightly, her jaw tightening as she realized that Shirley was not someone she could push around. Still, she attempted one last move, stating that the matter would need to be reviewed by the HOA board and that Shirley would have to wait until the next meeting. Shirley held her gaze for a long moment before giving a small, knowing smile. "Then I hope you are ready for what comes next." Without another word, she gathered her paperwork and walked out, leaving Margaret standing there, visibly unsettled. By the time Shirley got home, she had already made several calls. She wasn't just preparing for a legal battle. She was ensuring that by the time this fight was over, the HOA would regret ever targeting her son. Her first call had been to a close colleague at the Department of Housing, someone well-versed in the legalities surrounding accessibility laws. As expected, they confirmed that the HOA had violated multiple federal and state regulations, making their actions not only unethical, but entirely illegal. The second call was to a city official, requesting an immediate review of the HOA's actions. And the third, the one that would likely deliver the biggest impact, was to a local journalist who had covered cases of HOA abuse before. If there was one thing Shirley understood better than most, it was that the court of public opinion often moved faster than the legal system. People might not always understand complex legal statutes, but they did understand the cruelty of an organization stripping away a child's independence over something as petty as aesthetics. If the HOA wanted to maintain its reputation, They were about to learn just how quickly public outrage could turn against them. As she sat at her kitchen table, reviewing the documents she had gathered, she heard the front door open. Jake rolled into the room, his frustration evident. "What did they say?" he asked, his voice laced with anger. Shirley set down her papers and met his gaze with unwavering determination. "They said no for now, but that won't last long." She watched as her son's shoulders tensed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had always been strong, refusing to let his condition define him, but this was different. This was a reminder that there were still people in the world who saw him as an inconvenience rather than a person. Shirley refused to let him feel powerless. "We're going to fight this," she said firmly. "And we are going to win." The next morning, Shirley's plan was set in motion. The city officials had agreed to send an inspector to assess the violation, and the journalist she had contacted was eager to run a story on the abuse of power within the HOA. As she prepared for the day ahead, she received an unexpected email. It was from another resident in the neighborhood, someone she had spoken to only in passing. The message was short but powerful. "I saw what they did to your son's ramp. You're not the only one they've gone after. If you need witnesses, I'll speak up." That was all Shirley needed to see. She had known Margaret was controlling, but now it was clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern of abuse, and it was time to put an end to it once and for all. The city inspector arrived that afternoon. He was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, a clipboard in one hand, and an air of authority that suggested he had seen more than his fair share of HOA disputes. As Shirley led him to the front of the house, she could already see a few neighbors peeking through their windows, no doubt curious about what was happening. The inspector wasted no time getting to work. He measured the space where the ramp had once stood, took several photos, and jotted down notes as Shirley provided him with copies of the original permits and medical documentation. She watched as his expression shifted from neutral professionalism to something closer to frustration. "This shouldn't have been removed," he said, shaking his head. "There are federal protections in place for accessibility structures like this." Shirley nodded, her voice steady. "I know. That's why I need a formal report confirming the violation." He sighed, flipping through the documents before giving a firm nod. "You'll have it by the end of the day." Shirley thanked him, but before he could leave, another voice interrupted. "I hope you're not suggesting that the HOA did anything wrong." Margaret had appeared, arms crossed, her tone laced with feigned innocence. The inspector turned to her, unimpressed. "The law is very clear on accessibility structures. Removing this was a violation." Margaret's smile barely wavered. "The structure was never approved," she claimed. Shirley immediately held up the signed permits, her voice unwavering. "It was approved, legally." Margaret's expression tightened for the briefest moment before she quickly recovered. "Well, we'll have to see what the board decides." The inspector gave her a pointed look. "The law isn't up for board discussion. If the ramp isn't reinstated, there will be consequences." Without another word, he turned and left, leaving Margaret standing there, clearly unsettled. Shirley watched her carefully, noting the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Margaret had relied on fear and control for years, but this time, she was facing someone who wasn't going to back down. As Shirley walked back inside, her phone buzzed. The journalist she had contacted had just published the article. The headline was bold and unflinching. "HOA faces backlash after destroying disabled child's wheelchair ramp." The fight had just gone public. By the next morning, the article had spread further than Shirley anticipated. What had started as a local piece had been picked up by several larger news outlets, and now the HOA's actions were being discussed far beyond their quiet suburban neighborhood. The comments flooded in, people outraged at the blatant discrimination, legal experts weighing in on the clear violation of federal law, and even disability advocates calling for immediate action. The pressure was building, and Margaret had to be feeling it. Shirley didn't have to wait long for confirmation. By noon, an emergency HOA meeting had been announced, and according to the notice, the board would be discussing community concerns regarding recent events. That was all the proof Shirley needed to know that they were scrambling. When she arrived at the meeting later that evening, the room was more crowded than she had ever seen it. Normally, HOA meetings were sparsely attended, with only a handful of homeowners showing up to hear the latest rule changes and minor disputes. But tonight, the room was packed. People who had never spoken up before were now present, whispering among themselves, some holding printed copies of the article that had exposed the HOA's actions. Shirley took her seat near the front, her expression calm but unshakable. Margaret sat at the center of the board's long table, her usual confidence replaced with a forced neutrality. The moment the meeting was called to order, she launched into a carefully worded statement about how the HOA deeply regretted any misunderstandings and was committed to ensuring compliance with all relevant laws. It was clear that she was trying to control the damage, but Shirley wasn't going to let her manipulate the narrative. When the floor was open for comments, Shirley stood. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The weight of her words was enough. What happened to my son was not a misunderstanding. It was a violation of his rights, a violation of federal law, and an abuse of power by this board. You knew the ramp was legal, and you destroyed it anyway. A murmur spread through the room, neighbors nodding in agreement, some even voicing their support out loud. Margaret stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. But before she could respond, another homeowner stood up. Then another. People began sharing their own grievances, stories of excessive fines, arbitrary rules, and the overreach that had been tolerated for far too long. The illusion of control Margaret had maintained for years was crumbling. Shirley could see it in her eyes, the realization that she was no longer the one in charge. And then, just when Margaret seemed to be regaining her composure, the city inspector entered the room, official documents in hand. The ramp removal was illegal, he announced, and the HOA was formally ordered to restore it immediately. Margaret's face drained of color. For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken, as if she had finally realized that this situation had spiraled out of her control. The inspector continued, stating in no uncertain terms that the HOA had violated federal accessibility laws and that failure to comply with the order to restore the ramp would result in legal consequences. The room was dead silent as his words settled over the crowd. Then, murmurs started spreading, neighbors exchanging glances, some whispering in disbelief. Margaret, however, remained stiff, gripping the edges of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "We will need time to review this," she said finally, her voice clipped. "The board will discuss." The inspector cut her off immediately. "This isn't up for discussion. The ramp must be reinstated. Noncompliance could result in lawsuits, fines, and further penalties." His tone left no room for argument. Shirley watched as Margaret's jaw clenched, her frustration barely concealed. But before she could try to argue further, another voice spoke up. "Enough of this." One of the HOA board members, an older man who had remained quiet until now, finally broke his silence. "We all know this never should have happened. We let things go too far, and now we're paying the price." His admission sent a ripple through the crowd, and another board member nodded in agreement. The pressure was mounting. Margaret was losing control. Shirley remained still, watching as the shift unfolded before her eyes. She had spent her career breaking down corrupt institutions, and she recognized this moment for what it was, the exact point when those in power realized they were outnumbered. More voices began speaking, residents stepping forward to share their grievances. Complaints that had been whispered in private were now being aired openly. Unfair fines, intimidation tactics, abuse of authority. It was as if a dam had broken. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, but it was obvious that the tide had turned against her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she exhaled sharply, then turned to Shirley. "The ramp will be reinstated," she said, forcing the words out as if they physically pained her. The words might have been a victory, but Shirley wasn't finished yet. "And?" she prompted, waiting. Margaret's eyes flashed, but she knew there was no way out of this. "And the HOA will cover the full cost of the replacement," she added begrudgingly. A satisfied murmur ran through the crowd, but Shirley wasn't done. She held her ground, staring at Margaret expectantly. "And an official apology," she said, publicly. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she knew she had no choice. "Fine," she bit out. "The HOA will issue a public apology." Shirley finally nodded, satisfied. The fight wasn't just about a ramp. It was about accountability, about ensuring that no other family in this neighborhood had to endure the same abuse of power. And now, the people who had caused this injustice were being forced to answer for it. The following week, the ramp was rebuilt. This time, it was done under city supervision, ensuring that the HOA had no way to interfere. Shirley stood by with Jake as the workers installed each piece, securing it properly and double-checking every measurement. The moment it was complete, Jake rolled forward, testing it out, his movements smoother than before. A small smile crossed his face, one that made Shirley's chest tighten with emotion. It was not just about the ramp. It was about the fact that he had been made to feel like he didn't belong, and now that was being undone. The HOA's forced apology arrived 2 days later. It was brief, carefully worded, and filled with legal jargon designed to protect them from liability, but it was still an admission of guilt. Margaret, who had once been the neighborhood's most untouchable figure, had been humbled in front of the entire community. But that wasn't the only consequence she faced. As Shirley had predicted, the fallout didn't stop at the ramp. The investigation into the HOA's financial practices had begun, triggered by the city's involvement in the case. Complaints that had previously gone ignored were now being reviewed, and it didn't take long for irregularities to surface. Unauthorized fines, missing funds, unapproved expenses, all signs of an organization that had operated without oversight for far too long. Margaret tried to contain the damage, but it was too late. The board, eager to distance themselves from her, held an emergency vote, and by the end of the month, she was officially removed as HOA president. A for sale sign appeared in front of her house shortly after, a silent but undeniable testament to her downfall. As Shirley watched the moving trucks pull away weeks later, she felt no sympathy. Margaret had built her power on intimidation and control, believing she was above the very rules she enforced. But in the end, justice had prevailed. Shirley had ensured it, and as she turned back toward her house, she saw Jake waiting at the top of the ramp, the same ramp no one would ever be able to take away again. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt different. Without Margaret's iron grip controlling every aspect of life, people seemed more relaxed, more willing to engage with one another. The HOA, now under new leadership, was forced to reevaluate many of its previous policies, and several of Margaret's most arbitrary rules were overturned. Homeowners who had once feared fines and retaliation were now making small improvements to their homes without the constant worry of a violation notice appearing on their doorstep. The community, once dictated by rigid control, was finally starting to feel like an actual neighborhood again. Shirley knew that her battle had set a precedent. The HOA had been reminded that power was not absolute, that rules existed to serve the people, not to control them. More importantly, they had learned that when they crossed a line, there would be consequences. Shirley had fought many legal battles throughout her career, but this one had been the most personal. It wasn't just about her son's rights. It was about ensuring that no one else in the neighborhood would have to endure the same mistreatment. As she stood by the front door, watching Jake move freely down the ramp, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had won, not just in the legal sense, but in a way that truly mattered. Her son had his independence back, and the people who had tried to take it away had been held accountable. The fight had been worth it, and if anyone ever tried to pull something like this again, they would know exactly who they were up against. The morning sun cast golden rays through the old wooden blinds, illuminating the dust particles that danced in the air. Samuel Carter slowly opened his eyes to the familiar sound of birds chirping outside his window, their melodies a routine part of his mornings. He stretched his aching limbs, the stiffness of age reminding him that time was relentless. Despite his years, his mind was as sharp as ever, and his connection to the land he had called home for over 60 years remained unshaken. This place was more than just a house, it was his sanctuary, the last remnant of a life filled with triumphs, losses, and quiet moments of solitude. As he shuffled into the kitchen and poured himself a steaming cup of coffee, something outside the window caught his attention. A small white paper fluttered on his front door, secured by a single strip of tape. His brows furrowed. It wasn't a newspaper or an advertisement. Something about it felt different. Samuel sighed, setting his coffee down before stepping onto the porch. The crisp morning air brushed against his face as he peeled the paper from the door, a deep sense of unease settling in his chest. His eyes scanned the bold, capitalized letters at the top, and his heartbeat quickened. Final notice: delinquent homeowner association dues. A chill ran down his spine. He skimmed through the rest of the document, his breath hitching at the demand. Dear property owner, our records indicate that you have an outstanding balance of $122,000 in unpaid homeowners association dues. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in legal action, which may include foreclosure of your property. Samuel clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around the paper. Homeowners association? He had never signed up for any homeowners association. This land had been in his family since his father bought it after returning from World War II. Samuel had built this house with his own two hands after leaving the military, brick by brick. How could he possibly owe money to an organization he had never agreed to be a part of? His eyes dropped to the signature at the bottom. Nathan Holloway, president of the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association. Below was an address for the HOA office and a phone number for urgent payment arrangements. Samuel exhaled sharply. This had to be some kind of mistake. He wasn't part of any homeowners association. He had lived here for decades without interference, and he wasn't about to start answering to some bureaucratic paper pushers who thought they could waltz in and take what wasn't theirs. His gut told him this wasn't just a clerical error. He had heard the horror stories. HOAs abusing their power, bullying homeowners into compliance, even seizing properties under the guise of unpaid dues. But this wasn't some cookie-cutter subdivision. This was his private land, and yet, here he was being treated like a trespasser on his own property. Samuel wasted no time. He stepped back inside, placed the letter on the table, and grabbed his old reading glasses. Sitting down, he took a deep breath and examined every line carefully. Nowhere in the notice was there mention of a contract or agreement he had signed. It was just a demand for payment, backed by an aggressive threat. He scoffed. If they thought he would just roll over and pay, they had another thing coming. He needed answers. Picking up the phone, he dialed the number listed at the bottom of the letter. It rang a few times before an automated voice greeted him. Thank you for calling Ridgecrest Homeowners Association. If you're calling about a past due balance, press 1. If you would like to speak to a representative, press 2. Samuel pressed 2. A few seconds later, a woman's voice came through the line. Ridgecrest Homeowners Association, this is Laura speaking. How may I assist you today? Samuel's voice was steady but firm. This is Samuel Carter. I just received a notice claiming I owe money to your homeowners association, but I've never been part of one. I need someone to explain why I'm being charged for something I never agreed to. There was a brief pause before Laura responded, her tone carrying the distinct air of someone reading from a script. Mr. Carter, our records show that your property is now part of the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association due to recent community zoning adjustments. As part of this transition, all homeowners are required to comply with HOA regulations, including the payment of dues. Samuel narrowed his eyes. Zoning adjustments? My land isn't part of any community development. It's private property. I understand your concerns, sir, but all properties within the newly designated Ridgecrest residential zone are subject to HOA governance. If you would like to dispute this, you will need to submit a formal appeal in writing. However, please note that homeowners association dues are mandatory and non-negotiable. Samuel clenched his fist. You can't just throw me into a homeowners association without my consent and demand I pay thousands of dollars. The woman's voice remained composed, but carried a hint of irritation. Sir, the HOA board has already issued multiple notices regarding this transition. If you have further disputes, you will need to speak directly with our president, Mr. Holloway. I can schedule an appointment for you if you'd like. Samuel exhaled through his nose. Fine. Set it up. Tomorrow at 10. Our office is located at 25 Ridgecrest Drive. Samuel hung up without another word. He sat in silence for a moment, staring at the notice on the table. A storm was brewing, and he could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move to steal his land. But they had made a grave mistake. They had underestimated him. He may have been 90 years old, But Samuel Carter wasn't going anywhere without a fight. Samuel Carter arrived at the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association office precisely at 10 a.m. the next morning. The building was a sleek, modern structure with floor-to-ceiling glass windows that stood in stark contrast to the historic charm of the town. It reeked of bureaucracy, a place built on paperwork and power plays, the kind of place where decisions were made behind closed doors with little regard for the people they affected. Samuel had dealt with men like these before. Self-important, power-hungry bureaucrats who saw homeowners as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. He had no patience for them. The reception area was cold and unwelcoming, decorated with minimalist furniture and a massive framed document on the wall that read Ridgecrest Homeowners Association Community Standards and Regulations. A woman sat behind the front desk, her face neutral as she typed away on a keyboard, barely acknowledging his presence. "Name?" she asked without looking up. "Samuel Carter," he replied, his voice steady. Her fingers hesitated for a second before she finally met his gaze, her expression shifting slightly. "Ah, you have a meeting with Mr. Holloway. Please take a seat." Samuel didn't bother. He remained standing, his hands in his pockets, surveying the room as if he owned it. A few minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, and a tall man in an expensive navy suit emerged from a nearby office. His hair was slicked back, his movements deliberate, and his expression carried the forced politeness of someone who was used to getting his way. "Mr. Carter," the man said with a practiced smile, extending a hand. "Nathan Holloway. I appreciate you taking the time to come in." Samuel didn't take the offered handshake. "Didn't have much of a choice, now did I?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Holloway withdrew his hand smoothly, unfazed. "Let's discuss this in my office." Samuel followed him into a large, meticulously organized office with a wall of windows that overlooked the manicured lawns of the new Ridgecrest housing development. The houses in the distance were all identical, neatly lined up like rows of soldiers, each one bearing the same sterile uniformity. It made Samuel sick. Holloway gestured to a chair, but Samuel remained standing. "I'm not here to make myself comfortable," he said. "I'm here because you people think you can steal my land." Holloway sighed, as if he were dealing with an unreasonable child. "Mr. Carter, let's not be dramatic. No one is stealing anything. The Ridgecrest community has undergone some restructuring, and your property now falls under HOA jurisdiction. It's standard practice." Samuel scoffed. "Standard practice? I've lived on that land for 60 years, built my home with my own hands. There was no homeowners association then, and I sure as hell never signed anything saying I wanted to be part of one." Holloway leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "I understand your frustration, but legally, when a community is rezoned, existing properties are incorporated into the new HOA guidelines. It's all within the county's authority." Samuel narrowed his eyes. "And let me guess, you had nothing to do with that rezoning, did you?" Holloway's smile didn't waver. "The board simply proposed what we thought was best for the future of Ridgecrest." Samuel shook his head. "You mean the future where you get to line your pockets while people like me are forced out of our homes?" Holloway sighed dramatically. "Mr. Carter, no one is forcing you out. You're simply being asked to contribute to the maintenance of the community like all other residents." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Except I was never part of your community. I don't use your roads, your facilities, or your services, and I sure as hell didn't vote for any of this." Holloway tapped his fingers on the desk. "Regardless of how you feel about it, the dues must be paid. If they're not, legal action will be taken." Samuel crossed his arms. "And if I don't pay?" Holloway leaned back in his chair, his voice smooth. "Then the HOA will place a lien on your property." There was the real threat. Samuel took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "A lien for dues I never agreed to pay. That's how you operate?" Holloway's expression remained composed. "That's how the system works, Mr. Carter. Once the lien is in place, if the debt remains unpaid, foreclosure proceedings will begin." Samuel let the words settle in the air between them. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. They weren't trying to collect dues. They were trying to take his home. Holloway studied him for a moment, then offered a thin smile. "I think you'll find that fighting us will be far more costly than simply paying what you owe." Samuel didn't flinch. He He had faced worse men than Nathan Holloway in his lifetime. We'll see about that. With that, he turned and walked out of the office, his heart pounding, but his resolve solid. As soon as he stepped outside, he took a deep breath. The sun was still shining, but for the first time, his land, his home, felt like it was under siege. He had no intention of backing down. This fight was only just beginning. Samuel Carter didn't drive straight home after leaving the Homeowners Association office. He needed answers. His gut told him this wasn't just some bureaucratic overreach. This was a calculated move, a land grab disguised as policy. And if that was true, he needed to figure out exactly how deep this corruption went before it was too late. He steered his truck toward the county records office, a small beige building that had stood in the town for decades, outlasting the various city officials who passed through its doors. Samuel had been here before, years ago, when he fought to get his property taxes adjusted after an assessor tried to claim his land was part of a commercial district. That battle had taken months, but Samuel had won. He wasn't afraid of a long fight. The air inside smelled of dust and old paper, and behind the desk sat a young clerk, barely looking up from her computer as he approached. Without hesitation, Samuel placed the HOA notice on the counter and spoke with quiet authority. He needed to look up zoning records, specifically anything related to Ridgecrest. The clerk glanced at him skeptically before typing into her system. After a few moments, her frown deepened. Something was off. Samuel leaned in, watching her expression shift as she scanned the files. According to the initial zoning proposal, his property wasn't even included in the HOA's jurisdiction. His land had been separate from the community, untouched by any zoning changes. But then the clerk scrolled further, and there it was. An amendment had been added at the last minute, 3 months ago, long after the original rezoning had been proposed. Someone had gone in and deliberately altered the records to include his land. Samuel clenched his fists. He had been right. This wasn't just some blanket policy change. Someone had made a conscious decision to pull him into this mess, and there was only one name that made sense. When Samuel asked who had filed the amendment, the clerk hesitated before clicking through a few more pages. Then she exhaled sharply and turned the screen slightly toward him. The name at the bottom of the document was exactly who he expected: Nathan Holloway. Of course it was. The smug bureaucrat hadn't just taken advantage of the rezoning. He had ensured that Samuel's property was included, and now he was using that to leverage him into compliance. The clerk's voice was careful as she spoke, warning him that amendments like this were rarely made so late in the process. Someone had pulled strings to make it happen. Samuel gave her a knowing look and requested copies of every relevant document. As the pages printed, his mind raced through the possibilities. Holloway had deliberately added his land to the HOA's control. But why? This wasn't just about HOA fees. No one went to this much trouble over some neighborhood dues. There was something bigger at play, and Samuel intended to find out exactly what it was. When the clerk handed him the documents, he tucked them into his coat and thanked her before heading back to his truck. He wasn't going home. Not yet. He had one more stop to make. Emily Graves had been his attorney for years, handling everything from minor property disputes to tax assessments. She was sharp, relentless, and had a reputation for dismantling corrupt officials in court. If anyone could help him figure out the legal angle of this mess, it was her. The moment he walked into her office, she was on the phone, gesturing for him to take a seat. He lowered himself into the chair, waiting as she wrapped up her conversation. When she finally hung up, she leaned back, smirking as if she already knew why he was there. Samuel slid the stack of papers across her desk. This wasn't just about zoning changes. It was about a direct, targeted move against him. Emily flipped through the documents, her eyes narrowing as she reached the final amendment page. Holloway had personally filed it. That changed everything. She explained that while HOAs had a lot of leeway when it came to zoning, adding a property this late in the process wasn't standard. If they could prove that Holloway had a personal or financial reason for pulling his land into the HOA, they could challenge it. Samuel exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. He needed to know what Holloway was really after. Emily tapped her desk thoughtfully before offering a single piece of advice: start digging. Look into Holloway's financials, his connections, any backroom deals he might have made. If they could find a link between him and a larger development scheme, they could expose it. Samuel nodded, already forming a plan in his mind. He had been dragged into this fight, but he wasn't going to just sit back and let them win. As he left the office, stepping into the cool evening air, he took a deep breath. This was his home, and no HOA, no corrupt official, no greedy businessman was going to take it from him. They had started a fight. Now they had to deal with the consequences. Samuel Carter woke up before dawn. The sky outside still a deep shade of blue with the first hints of morning light creeping over the horizon. He had barely slept. His mind had been running in circles, replaying everything he had learned at the county records office and everything Emily had told him the night before. There was no doubt now. Nathan Holloway had deliberately targeted his land. The real question was why. What made Samuel's property so valuable that Holloway had risked falsifying records just to bring it under the HOA's control? He poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam curling up into the dimly lit kitchen, and stared out the window at the land he had spent decades calling home. He knew every inch of this place, every tree, every stretch of soil, every shift in the seasons. To the outside world, it might have looked like just another piece of land, but to him, it was his history, his legacy. And yet, for some reason, Holloway had gone out of his way to pull it into the HOA's jurisdiction. That meant something. Samuel didn't believe in coincidences. He needed to know exactly what Holloway was after, and he knew just the man who could help him find out. By mid-morning, Samuel was seated at a booth in a small diner on Main Street, nursing his second cup of coffee. The place had been around for decades, one of the few buildings in town that hadn't been bulldozed to make way for more modern developments like the ones Holloway and his HOA were pushing. A few minutes later, a man in his late 60s walked in, his boots heavy against the tile floor. He moved with a slight limp, a leftover souvenir from their time in the military together, and wore an old flannel shirt that had seen better days. But his eyes were as sharp as ever. Tom Reynolds slid into the booth across from Samuel, giving him a long look before shaking his head. "Been a while," he muttered. "Too long," Samuel agreed, waving down the waitress for a fresh cup of coffee. "Appreciate you meeting me on short notice." Tom grunted, watching as the waitress poured his coffee. Figured it had to be something serious. Samuel didn't waste time. He pulled the county records documents from his coat and slid them across the table. Tom picked them up, his eyes scanning the pages with a practiced efficiency. A low whistle escaped his lips as he flipped through the documents. "Damn," he muttered. "He really went after you." Samuel nodded. "The question is why?" Tom set the papers down and leaned back in his seat, rubbing his jaw. "Rezoning's a dirty game. People like Holloway don't do this kind of thing unless there's a big payout waiting at the end." Samuel narrowed his eyes. "What kind of payout?" Tom exhaled sharply, thinking. "Could be anything: commercial development, government subsidies, mineral rights. But if they're willing to go after private land like yours, it's not just about money. It's about control." Samuel's expression darkened. "Control of what?" Tom sighed, his fingers tapping against the table. "I'll make some calls." Samuel nodded. "Appreciate it." The two sat in silence for a moment before Tom smirked. "You really think you can take these bastards on by yourself?" Samuel smirked right back. "I'm not by myself." That evening, Samuel sat on his porch, staring out at his land as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the distant scent of rain. His phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Tom. "You were right," Tom said without preamble. Samuel sat up straighter. "What did you find?" "There's a development deal in the works. A big one. Commercial investors are looking to buy up land for some high-end project." Tom paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "The catch is, they need a certain amount of acreage to qualify for state funding. And your property puts them over the threshold." Samuel felt his blood turn to ice. "So this isn't just about HOA dues." "Hell no," Tom said. "Holloway is using the HOA as a tool to squeeze you out. Once you're gone, they sell the whole thing as a package deal." Samuel clenched his jaw. "Bastards." Tom sighed. "You got proof now, but that won't stop them. They'll double down. You ready for that?" Samuel looked out at his land, his home, the place he had spent his entire life protecting. He had fought for it before. He'd fight for it again. "Damn right I'm ready." The next morning, Samuel drove back to Emily's office, the documents from Tom in hand. She read through them, her face darkening. This changes everything. Samuel nodded. They're going to come at me harder now. I need to hit first. Emily leaned forward, her eyes flashing with determination. I have an idea. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Let's hear it. Emily smirked. We're going to make this very public. Samuel nodded slowly. How public? Emily's grin widened. I hope you don't mind some cameras on your lawn. Samuel chuckled. Let's give them a show. The fight was about to get a lot bigger. Samuel Carter stood on his porch, staring out at the land that had been his for over 60 years. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant sound of birds in the trees. But today, something felt different. There was an electricity in the air, an anticipation of the battle that was about to unfold. True to Emily's plan, things had already been set in motion. The local news station had picked up the story, and a reporter was scheduled to arrive at noon. But that wasn't all. Over the last 24 hours, word had spread like wildfire. Neighbors, townsfolk, and even strangers from outside the community had caught wind of what was happening. People were outraged. The idea of a greedy homeowners association forcing a 90-year-old veteran off his land for the sake of some corporate deal didn't sit well with anyone. Samuel could already hear the hum of approaching cars as people began gathering at the end of his long gravel driveway. Some held signs, others had cameras, and a few simply stood in quiet solidarity. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but if this was what it took to fight back, then so be it. At precisely noon, a sleek news van pulled up, and a woman in a navy blazer stepped out, adjusting her earpiece. A cameraman followed close behind, hoisting a large camera onto his shoulder. The reporter approached Samuel, extending her hand. Mr. Carter, I'm Jessica Clark with Channel 7 News. Thank you for speaking with us today. Samuel shook her hand firmly. Appreciate you coming out here. People need to know what's really going on. Jessica nodded, glancing around at the growing crowd before signaling for her cameraman to begin recording. The red light on the camera blinked to life, and Jessica turned to face it, her voice professional and steady. We're here today in Ridgecrest, where a shocking legal battle is unfolding. 90-year-old veteran Samuel Carter is being threatened with foreclosure on his property due to alleged unpaid homeowners association dues. But the twist, Mr. Carter has never been part of the homeowners association. His land was forcibly incorporated into the HOA through what appears to be a fraudulent zoning amendment. Now, the homeowners association, led by President Nathan Holloway, is pushing for legal action to remove him from his home. The question is why? She turned back to Samuel. Mr. Carter, can you tell us in your own words what's happening? Samuel took a deep breath, then spoke clearly, his voice unwavering. This land has been in my family for generations. I built my home with my own hands. I never signed up for any homeowners association, never agreed to pay their dues, and I sure as hell never gave them the right to tell me what to do on my own property. This isn't about community upkeep. This is about greed. Holloway and his homeowners association want my land so they can sell it off for profit. They think they can push me out because I'm old, but they're wrong. The crowd behind him erupted in cheers and murmurs of agreement. Jessica nodded, then turned to face the camera again. The homeowners association has yet to provide an official statement, but records obtained by Mr. Carter's legal team suggest that his property was deliberately added to the HOA's jurisdiction months after the initial rezoning process. If proven, this could constitute a fraudulent land grab. At that moment, the sound of screeching tires pulled everyone's attention toward the main road. A black luxury SUV rolled to a stop, and the driver's side door swung open. Nathan Holloway stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel, his face twisted into something between frustration and forced composure. He adjusted his suit jacket before striding toward the news crew. Jessica wasted no time. Mr. Holloway, she called, microphone in hand. Do you have a response to the allegations that the Homeowners Association deliberately amended zoning laws to include Mr. Carter's property without his consent? Holloway forced a smile, though his eyes betrayed his irritation. This is a simple misunderstanding. The homeowners association is merely ensuring that all properties within the community contribute their fair share to maintenance and improvements. Samuel stepped forward. Don't feed them that nonsense, Holloway. You and I both know this is about money. Holloway's smile faltered. Mr. Carter, if you had concerns, you should have brought them to the board instead of stirring up a media circus. Samuel crossed his arms. I did. You told me to pay up or lose my home. Jessica pressed forward. Mr. Holloway, if Mr. Carter's land was not originally included in the rezoning, why was an amendment filed months later to incorporate his property? Holloway hesitated, and in that moment, Samuel knew he had him cornered. Before Holloway could recover, a new voice cut through the air. I can answer that. The crowd parted as a man in a crisp suit approached, a folder in hand. It was Tom's contact from the county office. He held up the folder. This contains copies of internal emails between Holloway and a county zoning official, proving that the amendment was made at his request after he had already entered negotiations with private developers. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Holloway's face turned ashen. That's privileged information. No, it's public record now, the official countered. And I'm here to inform you that the county has launched an official investigation into the fraudulent zoning practices of the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association. The crowd erupted in cheers. Jessica turned to the camera, barely able to contain her own astonishment. It appears that this story has taken a dramatic turn. With a formal investigation now underway, the fate of the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association and its president remains uncertain. Holloway, realizing the walls were closing in, turned to Samuel, his voice low and furious. You just made a powerful enemy, Carter. Samuel smirked. I've fought bigger enemies than you. Holloway stormed back to his SUV, slamming the door before speeding off. The moment he was gone, people cheered louder, reporters swarmed eager to get more details. But Samuel simply exhaled and turned to Emily, who had been watching the entire thing with a victorious grin. You did it, she said. We did it, Samuel corrected. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was swift. The county's investigation uncovered years of corruption within the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association, leading to multiple resignations and lawsuits. Holloway was removed from his position and later arrested for fraud. Without its corrupt leadership, the HOA collapsed entirely, and Samuel stayed right where he belonged, on his land, in his home, where no one could ever take it from him again. As he sat on his porch, watching the sunset over his fields, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Samuel Carter sat in his living room, stacks of legal documents spread out on the table in front of him. The investigation into the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association had gained momentum, and with the county officials now involved, Holloway's fraudulent zoning scheme was unraveling faster than he could contain it. But Samuel knew that men like Holloway never went down without a fight. There was still a chance that he would try to stall the process, find loopholes, or use his influence to delay the inevitable. Samuel had spent his life dealing with men who thought they could manipulate the system to their advantage, and he wasn't about to let Holloway slip through the cracks. He had come too far to stop now. Just as he was reviewing the latest legal notices from Emily, a knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Tom stood on the porch, holding a thick manila envelope. Without a word, he stepped inside and handed it over. Samuel opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. Inside were more documents, but this time, they weren't just legal records. They were financial statements, property transfers, and internal memos from Ridgecrest board members. His eyes narrowed as he flipped through them. These weren't just any files. They were proof that Holloway had been personally profiting from the HOA's aggressive foreclosures. Several properties had been seized under similar claims of unpaid dues, only to be quickly sold to private developers for a fraction of their market value. The connections were clear. Holloway wasn't just enforcing HOA policies. He was running a full-scale real estate scam under the guise of community regulations. Samuel exhaled sharply, feeling the weight of what he was holding. This was it. This was the evidence they needed to not just expose Holloway, but to ensure he faced real consequences. Tom leaned against the wall, watching Samuel's reaction. You see it now, don't you? This was never about maintenance fees or zoning laws. It was about money, power and control. Samuel clenched his jaw, and he was willing to ruin lives to get it. Tom nodded, and he would have gotten away with it too, if you hadn't fought back. Samuel knew what had to be done. He grabbed his phone and dialed Emily. The moment she picked up, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We have him. He's been flipping foreclosed properties for profit." Emily's voice sharpened with interest. "Are you sure?" Samuel looked down at the documents again. "Positive. Holloway isn't just enforcing HOA rules. He's orchestrating a fraud scheme." There was a pause on the other end before Emily responded, her tone decisive. "Then we need to take this straight to the county prosecutor." Samuel nodded. "That's exactly what I was thinking." Later that afternoon, Samuel and Emily met with the lead investigator from the county's legal office, presenting every document, email, and financial record they had gathered. The investigator listened carefully, flipping through the pages with a growing look of concern. When he reached the final set of documents, he let out a slow breath. "This is enough to bring criminal charges. Holloway won't just lose his position. He'll be facing serious jail time." Samuel felt a grim satisfaction settle in his chest. "Good. Because men like him don't stop unless they're forced to." Emily smirked. "And we're about to make sure that happens." As they left the prosecutor's office, Samuel took a deep breath. The weight of the past few weeks had been immense, but for the first time, he felt like they were finally on the verge of victory. Ridgecrest had spent years abusing its authority, preying on homeowners who didn't have the resources to fight back. But this time, they had gone after the wrong man. And now, justice was coming. Samuel Carter sat on his porch as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over his land. The weight of the past few weeks pressed on him, but for the first time, there was a sense of momentum. The prosecutor had the documents, the investigation was moving forward, and Holloway was running out of places to hide. But Samuel knew better than to celebrate too early. Men like Holloway didn't go down without a fight, and if he had learned anything over the years, it was that when powerful men got desperate, they got dangerous. Just as he was about to head inside, his phone buzzed. It was Emily. "You need to get to my office now." There was an urgency in her voice that made Samuel's stomach tighten. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and left. The moment he walked through the door of Emily's office, he could tell something was wrong. She was pacing, a stack of papers in her hands, her face lined with frustration. He closed the door behind him. "What happened?" Emily threw the papers onto her desk. "Holloway's lawyers just filed a countersuit." Samuel's expression darkened. "On what grounds?" She exhaled sharply. "Defamation. They're claiming that by going to the press and exposing the HOA's practices, you've damaged Holloway's reputation and the reputation of Ridgecrest." Samuel scoffed. "Damaged his reputation? He's a crook. He added my land to the HOA illegally, used it as a bargaining chip for his deals, and tried to force me out of my home. He's the one who should be worried about his reputation." Emily nodded, but her face remained tense. "I agree, but this isn't just about making noise. It's a stall tactic. If he can drag this out in court long enough, he might be able to cover his tracks or pressure you into settling." Samuel leaned forward, his jaw tight. "I'm not settling." She smirked. "I didn't think you would. But we need to be careful. This isn't just about proving he's guilty anymore. Now we need to prove that you didn't knowingly spread false information." He narrowed his eyes. "We have evidence. That should be enough." Emily tapped her fingers on the desk. "You'd think so, but his legal team is going to argue that you misrepresented the situation, that you went public with the intention of ruining him. And they'll try to bury us in paperwork, stall proceedings, and make this as expensive as possible." Samuel exhaled through his nose. "So, what do we do?" Emily picked up one of the documents and held it up. "We don't just defend. We go on the offensive. The fraud investigation is already underway. But if we can push for a full financial audit of the Ridgecrest HOA, we might uncover more than just property flipping. We might be able to prove embezzlement." Samuel's eyes sharpened. "You think he was stealing from the HOA?" Emily nodded. "It's possible. The sudden rezoning, the way properties were seized and resold, the fact that some of those funds never seem to have been properly accounted for, it all points to something bigger. And if we can expose it, Holloway won't just lose the case, he'll lose everything." Samuel let that sink in. Holloway had thought he could strong-arm him into backing down. But now the fight had escalated beyond just one man's land. This was about everyone who had been wronged by Ridgecrest corruption. Samuel straightened his back. Then let's tear it all down. Emily grinned. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. She reached for her phone. I'll start making the necessary filings. The moment we push for an audit, this whole thing is going to explode. Samuel simply nodded. Let it. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about justice. And he wasn't going to stop until Holloway had nowhere left to run. Samuel Carter stood by the window of Emily's office, staring out at the city skyline while she made the calls to push for the financial audit. The sun had set, and the streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows along the pavement. He had been in fights before, but this was different. This wasn't about fists or survival. It was about tearing down a corrupt system that had thrived on greed and manipulation for far too long. The sound of Emily hanging up her phone snapped him back to reality. It's done. The court approved the request for an independent audit. Holloway won't be able to stall this one. Samuel turned to face her. How soon does it start? Emily leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. The auditors are getting access first thing in the morning. Ridgecrest's financial records are now officially under scrutiny. If there's anything illegal buried in those numbers, we'll find it. Samuel nodded. It was only a matter of time now. Holloway had been playing a long game, using legal loopholes and intimidation to keep his operation running. But the cracks were finally starting to show. The question was, how desperate would he get now that the walls were closing in? As if answering that thought, Emily's office phone rang again. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. Ridgecrest's legal team. Samuel crossed his arms. Put on speaker. Emily hit the button, and a cold, measured voice filled the room. Ms. Graves, we've just been informed that your client has initiated a financial audit against Ridgecrest Homeowners Association. This is an unnecessary escalation and a blatant attempt to harass our organization. Emily smirked. It's not harassment if it's legal. The voice on the other end remained composed. We're prepared to counter this action with a formal complaint of legal overreach and malicious intent. If this audit does not cease immediately, we will seek damages. Samuel's patience was wearing thin. He stepped closer to the desk. You tell Holloway that if he had nothing to hide, he wouldn't be afraid of an audit. There was a brief pause before the man responded. Mr. Carter, I advise you to tread carefully. You're up against more than just a homeowners association. Samuel narrowed his eyes. Is that a threat? Another pause. Just a warning. The line went dead. Emily let out a slow breath, shaking her head. They're scared. That's the only reason they call to try and intimidate you. Samuel wasn't intimidated. He had seen fear in men's eyes before, and he recognized it now. Holloway's empire was crumbling, and for the first time, he was losing control. Samuel wasn't about to let up. If they were scared now, they had every reason to be, because the truth was coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The next morning, Samuel Carter arrived at the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association office, just as the auditors did. 3 professionals in dark suits stepped out of a government-issued sedan, their expressions unreadable as they approached the glass doors of the building. Samuel stood back, watching as they entered, feeling the weight of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just about some legal technicality anymore. This was about exposing the foundation of corruption that had propped up Holloway's empire for years. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Employees moved stiffly, avoiding eye contact with the auditors as they set up in the main conference room. Stacks of financial records were rolled in, and computer systems were unlocked for review. Holloway was nowhere to be seen, but his presence was felt in the nervous energy that lingered in the air. Samuel leaned against the wall near the entrance, arms crossed, as he observed the unfolding scene. It didn't take long before the first red flag surfaced. One of the auditors raised an eyebrow as he scanned a document on his screen. He exchanged a glance with his colleague before calling one of the Ridgecrest accountants over. This expense report. These numbers don't match the submitted filings from last quarter. The accountant hesitated. There must be a clerical error. We'll provide updated figures. The auditor gave him a pointed look. No need. We'll cross-check these ourselves. The accountant swallowed hard and backed away. Samuel smirked. Holloway's carefully crafted paper trail was beginning to unravel, and it was happening in real time. Just then, the front door swung open. Holloway entered, his face a mask of barely contained frustration. His eyes immediately locked on Samuel. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Samuel didn't move, watching the show. Holloway's jaw clenched, but before he could continue, one of the auditors stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway, we need you to answer some questions about these financial inconsistencies." Holloway forced a smile. "I'll have my legal team provide the necessary clarifications." The auditor shook his head. "That won't be necessary. We're pulling direct transaction histories. If there's nothing to hide, there shouldn't be an issue." Holloway's composure wavered. "I don't appreciate the implication." Samuel chuckled. "You don't have to. The facts speak for themselves." Holloway shot him a glare before turning back to the auditors. His voice was controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge of panic beneath it. "I need to speak with my attorney. We'll schedule an official response." The lead auditor remained unfazed. "You'll have that opportunity, but in the meantime, we'll continue our review." Holloway didn't respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked swiftly toward his office, his movements tense and deliberate. Samuel exchanged a glance with Emily, who had just arrived. She arched an eyebrow. "He's cracking." Samuel nodded. "And it's only going to get worse." Over the next several hours, the auditors uncovered more discrepancies. Missing funds, questionable property sales, large transfers to untraceable accounts. Each discovery chipped away at Holloway's defenses until, finally, the auditors stepped back. One of them made a call. Minutes later, 2 county officials entered the building, followed closely by uniformed officers. Samuel straightened. This was it. Holloway emerged from his office just as the lead county investigator approached him. "Nathan Holloway, you are under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and unlawful seizure of homeowner properties. You'll need to come with us." Holloway's face turned ashen. "You can't be serious. I'm the president of this association. This is a misunderstanding." The investigator remained firm. "You have the right to contest the charges in court. But for now, you'll be taken in for questioning." The room fell into stunned silence as the officers stepped forward. Holloway's breath quickened, his mind scrambling for a way out. But there was none. With no other option, he reluctantly placed his hands behind his back as the cuffs clicked into place. Samuel watched as they led him away. Holloway had built his empire on greed and deceit, but in the end, the truth had won. He took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. It was over. Ridgecrest's reign of corruption had come to an end. Emily stepped beside him, arms crossed. "Not bad for an old man." Samuel chuckled. "Not bad at all." Outside, news cameras flashed as Holloway was loaded into the back of a patrol car. The fight had been long, but justice had finally been served. And Samuel Carter had done what no one thought possible. He had taken down the most powerful man in Ridgecrest. Samuel Carter sat on his porch, the evening air cool against his skin as he gazed out at the land he had spent his life protecting. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind: investigations, legal battles, and a fight that had pushed him further than he thought he could go. But in the end, it had all been worth it. Ridgecrest Homeowners Association was collapsing. With Holloway arrested and facing multiple charges, the entire HOA board had been thrown into disarray. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak out were now coming forward, sharing their own experiences of intimidation and wrongful fines. The county had officially intervened, freezing Ridgecrest accounts and ordering a full audit of every transaction the HOA had made under Holloway's leadership. The scam was bigger than anyone had imagined. Over the years, Holloway had used Ridgecrest as his personal bank, funneling money from inflated fees, fabricated violations, and forced foreclosures straight into his own investments. But now it was over. The county had seized Ridgecrest records, multiple lawsuits were already being filed, and the HOA itself was on the brink of dissolution. The people of Ridgecrest were finally free. Samuel took a slow breath, the weight of it all finally settling in. He had won. His land was safe, his name cleared, and the corruption that had threatened to take everything from him had been exposed for all to see. But the victory wasn't just his. It belonged to every homeowner who had been wronged, to every person who had been too afraid to fight back. He had set a precedent. No HOA, no corrupt bureaucrat, no self-serving official could ever do this again without facing consequences. A car pulled up along his driveway, and he recognized it instantly. Emily stepped out, carrying a thick file of legal documents. She walked up the steps and handed them over with a smirk. Official confirmation. Your property is no longer under HOA jurisdiction. Samuel took the file, flipping through the pages, letting the words sink in. It was over, truly over. He looked up at Emily, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You did good, she said. Samuel chuckled. Not bad for an old man. Huh? She shook her head, amused. You're impossible. He watched as she leaned against the porch railing, her expression shifting to something more thoughtful. So, what now? Samuel exhaled, looking out over his land, the fields stretching out beneath the soft glow of the setting sun. For the first time in a long time, he had no battle to fight, no threats looming over his home. I think I'll just enjoy the quiet for a while. Emily nodded. You've earned that. The two sat in comfortable silence for a moment before she straightened. Well, if you ever feel like raising hell again, you know where to find me. Samuel smirked. I'll keep that in mind. As she drove away, he leaned back in his chair, the familiar creak of the old wood beneath him grounding him in the moment. He had spent his life fighting for what mattered. This fight had been no different. He had faced a system designed to break people like him, and he had beaten it. Not with money, not with power, but with sheer will and the truth on his side. The night air was still, the land around him peaceful. For the first time in years, Samuel Carter finally felt free. My hands trembled as I read the bright, red notice taped to my front door. $500. That was the fine the HOA expected me to pay for keeping an unauthorized exotic pet. I looked down at Whiskers, my completely ordinary orange tabby cat, rubbing against my legs the same way he did every evening when I got home from work. Exotic? He was as common as a peanut butter sandwich. After a long day at the law firm, finding this absurd notice waiting for me only added to my frustration. The date on the paper showed it had been placed that morning, likely right after I left for work. But what truly set my anger ablaze was the signature at the bottom. Karen Thompson, with her newly claimed title, HOA Board President. Karen had been in the neighborhood for only 6 months, yet she had already built a reputation for all the wrong reasons. She had complained that Mr. Rodriguez's wind chimes were too ethnic, reported Mrs. Chen's memorial garden as a violation of property aesthetics, and now she had come after my cat. The irony was that I had lived in Oakwood Heights for 15 years, 10 of which I had served as the HOA's legal counsel. In fact, I had personally written every single bylaw they were now attempting to use against me. But Karen had never done her research. She had not even bothered to check the records or introduce herself properly. I grabbed my phone and snapped photos of the notice before carefully peeling it off my door. Through my front window, I spotted Karen sitting on her porch across the street, pretending to water her illegal pink flamingo lawn ornaments. Yes, illegal. Section 7.3 of the bylaws specifically addressed lawn decorations, a rule I had originally drafted to be flexible for reasonable homeowners. But right now, those flamingos were the least of my concerns. Inside my house, I found another copy of the notice slipped under my door, along with a thick packet of violation documentation. I spread everything out on my kitchen table while Whiskers jumped up to investigate. The so-called evidence included blurry photos of my cat sitting in the window, a highlighted section of the pet regulations, and, this part nearly made me laugh, a printed WebMD article about exotic pet diseases. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Tom Baker. Did you get one too? I was about to reply when I heard voices outside. Through the kitchen window, I saw Karen leading her friend, Susan Barnes, door to door, distributing thick stacks of papers. They stopped at Mrs. Chen's house, and my stomach twisted. The elderly widow had already suffered enough while mourning her late husband, and now Karen was harassing her over a garden she had lovingly built in his memory. I was debating whether to step outside and intervene when my doorbell rang. It was Bob Miller, our neighborhood treasurer for the past 8 years. His usually cheerful expression was clouded with concern. Listen, he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. You need to know what happened at today's emergency board meeting. Karen pushed through a series of new enforcement measures. She's targeting at least 6 other homeowners with fines. She's calling it her Neighborhood Improvement Initiative. I invited Bob inside, grabbing a notepad as he shared more details. Karen had somehow convinced the board to grant her direct enforcement authority, a direct violation of Section 3.2 of the bylaws. She had also appointed Susan as her so-called enforcement deputy, a role that did not even exist in our HOA structure. As Bob left, I walked him to the door just in time to see Karen marching up Mrs. Chin's driveway, another notice in hand. Through the evening air, I could hear Mrs. Chin's distressed voice. But this bench, it's all I have left of him. That was it. I had written those bylaws to protect the community, not to be weaponized against innocent homeowners. I turned back inside, heading straight for my home office. If Karen wanted to play by the rules, she was about to learn what happens when you challenge the person who wrote them. I glanced at Whiskers, now curled up on my desk. "What do you say, buddy? Ready to teach them about karma?" He blinked lazily and purred, which I took as a yes. I had no idea at the time, but this was just the beginning of what would become the biggest HOA showdown our neighborhood had ever seen. I walked into the HOA meeting room with my folder of documents, fully prepared to have a calm discussion about the absurd fine. But Karen was already there, seated at the head of the table like a self-proclaimed queen ruling over her domain. She tapped her hot pink acrylic nails against the wooden surface, her smug smile making my stomach turn. "Good evening, everyone," I said politely while taking my seat, though I quickly noticed something unusual. Half of the regular board members were missing, and in their place sat Karen's tennis partners, Susan and Linda, 2 people who had never shown the slightest interest in HOA matters before. Karen cleared her throat dramatically before speaking. "Let's address the violation regarding your unauthorized exotic animal," she announced, enunciating each word like she was lecturing a child. "As documented here, your pet clearly violates Section 8 of our bylaws." I had to hold back a laugh. My cat, Whiskers, was a regular domestic shorthair, nothing remotely exotic about him. I had lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and he had been with me for 7 of them. I pulled out my veterinary records and set them on the table. I have all of his documentation right here. Karen, however, did not even glance at the papers. She was too busy admiring her freshly polished nails. "Rules are rules," she declared, while Susan and Linda nodded in perfect synchronization. "The fine stands, and if the animal is not removed within 30 days, additional penalties will apply." That was when I noticed something through the window. Karen's lawn, decorated with a cluster of bright pink flamingos, the same ones Susan and Linda also had in their yards. I remember drafting Section 7.3 of the bylaws, which specifically covered lawn ornaments, ensuring the rules were flexible enough to allow tasteful decorations while preventing excessive displays. "Speaking of rules," I said carefully, "I couldn't help but notice the matching lawn decorations at your properties. Perhaps we should take a moment to review the ornament guidelines as well." Karen's face turned bright red. "Those are limited edition collector's items, not common decorations. They're completely different." She shuffled through her papers, her confidence faltering for the first time. "Besides, we are here to discuss your pet violation, not my artistic choices." As I glanced around the room, I started to see other irregularities. The meeting minutes folder was unusually thin. The financial reports that were always present in the corner were nowhere in sight. And something else nagged at me. Wasn't there supposed to be a public notice period before board member changes? "I'd like to request copies of the last 6 months of meeting minutes," I said, keeping my voice even. "And while we are at it, I would love to see the documentation of the board member changes to ensure we are following all proper procedures." Karen's eye twitched slightly. "Those are being reorganized for efficiency purposes," she said, quickly steering the conversation back to her agenda. "Now, regarding your cat, we have received complaints about it disturbing the peace." "Really?" I asked, pulling out my phone. "Because I have an email here from our previous board president, specifically approving Whiskers' residency. Would you like to see it?" The room fell silent. Even Susan and Linda had stopped nodding in sync. "This meeting is adjourned," Karen announced abruptly, gathering her papers in a hurry. "You will receive further notice about your violations in writing." She practically sprinted out of the room, her heels clicking rapidly on the tile floor. As I walked home, Pieces started falling into place in my mind. Mrs. Chin's fine over her bench, the missing board members, the sudden reorganization of official documents. Karen wasn't just being difficult about my cat. There was something much bigger going on. And as the person who wrote these bylaws, I was probably the only one who could figure out exactly what it was. Scrolling through my contacts, I found Bob's number. Maybe it was time for a friendly conversation about those missing financial reports. After all, if Karen wanted to enforce rules, then we needed to make sure we were looking at all of them. My hands were shaking as I spread out all the HOA violation notices across my dining room table. Something wasn't adding up, and I knew it. That morning, I had run into Mrs. Chan crying on her front porch, clutching a notice identical to mine. Her violation? The beautifully hand-carved memorial bench her grandchildren had given her to honor their grandfather. Karen had labeled it an unauthorized structure. I started making calls to other neighbors, and a clear pattern began to emerge. Every single homeowner who had received a violation in the past 3 months was either elderly or lived alone. Not a single one of Karen's friends had been fined, despite their obvious violations. The Andersons had painted their front door a glaring shade of purple, which Karen's friend Susan had described as charming at the last board meeting, even though the bylaws clearly stated that all external paint colors required approval. My legal instincts kicked in. I opened my laptop and began documenting everything. I compiled photos of Karen's friends blatantly breaking the rules, the Williams' unauthorized above-ground pool, the Petersons' commercial vehicles parked in their driveway, and of course, those ridiculous flamingos multiplying on Karen's lawn. Then I created a map, marking every fine issued since Karen took over. The pattern was so obvious, it was almost laughable. Walking around the neighborhood with my camera, I noticed something even more suspicious. Karen's so-called landscaping improvement project had extended her backyard by nearly 3 feet into the community green space. I distinctly remembered handling the property surveys when I wrote the bylaws, and that was definitely not her land. That night, I dug through my old HOA files in the basement and found exactly what I needed, the original property maps. But just as I was piecing everything together, I heard a small rustling sound outside. I stepped onto my back porch and found little Tommy from next door, hiding behind my garage. His eyes were wide with fear. When I asked him what was wrong, he hesitated before whispering, "Karen said if I play basketball in my driveway again, my parents will get fined." My jaw clenched. Meanwhile, Karen's own grandchildren had a massive playground set up in their backyard, one that clearly exceeded height restrictions. The hypocrisy was staggering. I needed more information, and I knew exactly where to get it. The next morning, I made a trip to City Hall to check public records. What I found was shocking. Karen had never even filed the required paperwork for her home additions. But that wasn't the worst of it. As I dug deeper, I discovered something that made my stomach drop. Karen's position as HOA president might not even be legitimate. According to state law, certain procedures had to be followed for board elections, and the records showed clear discrepancies in her appointment. That was when my doorbell rang. It was Robert, our retired former maintenance supervisor. "I've been waiting for someone to start asking questions," he said, holding a thick folder in his hands. I kept copies of everything. Inside were maintenance requests Karen had denied without board approval, emails showing her directing contracts to her brother's company, and photos of property damage she had blamed on innocent homeowners. Just as I was sorting through the evidence, my security camera alerted me to movement outside. I looked at the footage and saw Susan sneaking up to my porch, not to leave a violation notice, but to take pictures of my front door, the same door that had been approved by the previous board 5 years ago. I smirked. I just caught her in the act of harassment. Sitting down at my desk, I realized this wasn't just about my cat anymore. Karen wasn't just picking a fight with me. She was targeting every decent homeowner in this community. And she had no idea she was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the true purpose of the bylaws I had written. But first, I had one more call to make, to an old friend at the local newspaper. After all, nothing scares an HOA bully more than public exposure. And I had a feeling tomorrow's board meeting was going to be very interesting indeed. At first, I thought I was alone in this fight, but that changed when Mrs. Chin knocked on my door at 7 a.m., clutching a box of old HOA letters. Her hands trembled as she laid them out on my table, 5 years' worth of unfair fines, each one signed by Karen with that same arrogant signature. As we flipped through the papers, more neighbors started arriving. Within an hour, 3 more people had come forward with nearly identical stories. That was when I realized this was bigger than just my cat. I decided to take action. I began holding quiet meetings in my garage every Tuesday night. At first, it was just 5 of us sharing coffee and frustration. By the 3rd week, 15 residents packed into the space between my parked car and storage boxes. Each person brought new pieces to the puzzle. Photos of Karen's friends blatantly violating HOA rules without consequences, copies of sudden fee increases that had never gone through proper channels, and even video evidence of her yelling at kids for playing hopscotch in their own driveways. But the real breakthrough came when Bob, our normally quiet treasurer, surprised everyone by slipping me a USB drive after church. "I've been keeping track," he whispered. "The numbers don't add up." He was right. The spreadsheet showed thousands of dollars in so-called miscellaneous maintenance fees, fees that never resulted in actual repairs. Meanwhile, our community pool had been shut down for 3 months because we supposedly couldn't afford a new filter. That was the moment I knew Karen's corruption went beyond just power trips and fines. This was about money. Then came an unexpected ally, Jim, the former HOA president, who had moved to Florida after retiring. When I emailed him about the situation, he spent an entire weekend digging through his garage for old documents. What he found was a gold mine. He had the original meeting minutes from when I had written the bylaws, proving that Karen was making up rules that didn't exist. Even better, he had recordings of past board meetings where she had voted in favor of the very policies she was now fining people for breaking. With every new piece of evidence, my dining room transformed into something out of a detective show. I marked up a map of the neighborhood with red pins, each one representing a home that had received unfair fines. Green pins represented the houses of Karen's friends, who had somehow remained untouched despite obvious violations. The pattern was so blatant that it almost looked comical. But the real turning point came when Sarah, a journalist from the local newspaper, caught wind of what was happening. She had her own grudge against Karen, since her daughter had been fined for having a non-HOA-approved basketball hoop. She started asking questions about the HOA's financial records, and suddenly Karen had a lot of scheduling conflicts. Even funnier was the look on her face when she realized I was documenting every single rule she was breaking, including how her own yard didn't meet the standards she was enforcing on everyone else. Then Lisa, who worked at the county clerk's office, made a discovery that left me stunned. Karen had never properly filed key HOA paperwork, meaning she had been enforcing rules with no legal standing. She was so busy fining people and playing queen of the neighborhood that she had forgotten to keep the HOA itself in compliance. I couldn't help but smile. All those years I spent ensuring every bylaw was airtight were finally going to pay off. As our evidence pile grew, so did our confidence. People stopped paying Karen's ridiculous fines. Kids started playing outside again. Mrs. Chun put her wind chimes back up, and for the first time in months, their gentle tinkling wasn't immediately met with a violation notice. We were ready. The next board meeting was going to be the moment everything came crashing down for Karen. She wanted to play by the rules. It was time to show her that we had been playing the real game all along. The community center buzzed with tension as I walked in carrying my thick binder of evidence. Karen sat at the head of the table, wearing her usual smug smile and an expensive blazer, completely unaware of what was coming. The room was packed. I had never seen so many neighbors at a board meeting before. Even Mr. Jenkins, who hadn't left his house since his hip surgery, had somehow made it. I noticed Karen's smile falter slightly when she saw my confident stride toward the podium. Susan leaned over and whispered something in her ear, but Karen just waved her off. Big mistake. Before we discussed the ridiculous fine about my cat, I began, keeping my voice steady and controlled. I'd like to address some concerning patterns I've discovered. I pulled out the first document from my binder, a detailed property map of our neighborhood. Funny how every single fine issued in the past 6 months has been given to homes marked in red on this map. Karen's expression twitched. Those are simply the violations we found. Interesting, I cut in because these red marks perfectly match the homes of people who voted against your election last year. The room erupted in whispers. But I wasn't done. And speaking of violations, let's talk about Article 2, Section 14 of our bylaws. Karen's face paled. She knew exactly what that section covered. I had written it specifically to prevent the abuse of power. The projection screen behind me lit up with archived photos of her house. Your unapproved pool installation last summer, the commercial vehicle parking violations, and of course, those lovely pink flamingos that somehow got a special exemption. Susan jumped up, her voice shrill. This is harassment. I calmly pulled out another document. Actually, Susan, according to the legal definition of harassment, which I've highlighted here from Section 8.2, a clause I also wrote, this is called documented evidence of bylaw violations. Would you like me to continue with the photos of your unauthorized fence extension? The room fell dead silent. Even Bob, our treasurer, struggled to hide his smirk. Karen's hands trembled as she shuffled through her papers, desperately searching for something to counter my claims. But the real issue isn't just selective enforcement, I continued, pulling out Mrs. Chen's violation notice. It's the blatant disregard for our community's values. This fine was issued to Mrs. Chen for a memorial bench, a bench that falls well within the acceptable guidelines I specifically included in Section 57 about memorial structures. Mrs. Chen, sitting in the front row, wiped away a tear as several neighbors patted her on the shoulder. Karen's face turned from pale to bright red. I saved the best for last. And now about my cat, Whiskers, the so-called exotic pet that triggered this entire investigation. I pulled out the original HOA pet clause, displaying it on the screen. I wrote this section myself 10 years ago, ensuring language that protects reasonable pet ownership. Would anyone like to guess who personally approved it? That's right, our former board president, who sent me this notarized statement confirming it. The room erupted in a mix of laughter and outraged murmurs. Karen stood up abruptly, her voice trembling with anger. This is all circumstantial. You can't actually, Bob interrupted, standing up with his own folder. I have the financial records showing unauthorized administrative fees that weren't approved by the board. Should we discuss those too? Karen looked around the room, suddenly realizing she was cornered. Her face twisted into an ugly scowl as she grabbed her things. This isn't over. I'll sue every single one of you. I couldn't help but smile. Section 128, Karen. Frivolous legal threats against board members carry a $1,000 fine. Would you like me to add that to your tab? The room fell into stunned silence. Karen's smirk began to fade as I opened my laptop and connected it to the projector. The first slide appeared, a side-by-side comparison of her house's unapproved bright purple trim next to the exact bylaw she had used to fine 3 other homeowners for their non-standard paint colors. Let's start with something simple, I said, keeping my tone even. Section 4.2, which I wrote during the Great Paint Color debate of 2010. I clicked through photos showing Karen's friends' violations next to fines she had issued for the same infractions. Susan shifted uncomfortably when her 3-foot garden gnome collection popped up on the screen. Bob stepped forward next. I have something to add, he said, pulling out a stack of papers. These are bank statements showing unusual administrative fees being charged to specific homeowners, all of whom have filed complaints against board members in the past year. The room erupted again, this time with gasps of outrage. Karen shot to her feet, her face turning as purple as her house trim. This is a witch hunt. You can't prove anything. She grabbed her designer purse, nearly knocking over her water bottle. I'll sue every one of you. I held up my hand. Before you make threats, Karen, you might want to review Section 11.3. I pulled up the relevant page. I added this clause specifically to protect homeowners from retaliatory legal action. Any board member making unfounded legal threats faces immediate removal and a fine equal to the legal fees they are attempting to cause. The room was dead silent. Mrs. Chun, who had been quietly watching from her seat, slowly stood up. Her voice was shaky but firm. When my Henry died, I just wanted a small bench to remember him by. You told me it was against the rules and fined me $1,000. She pulled out a wrinkled letter. But I found this old newsletter from when you approved your friend's entire backyard memorial fountain. More neighbors started speaking up. The family fine for their basketball hoop showed pictures of Karen's own yard filled with unapproved playground equipment. The college student who was penalized for parking his work truck presented documentation proving Karen's son regularly parked his broken-down RV in the neighborhood. Karen's face went from purple to white as the evidence stacked against her. She tried to interrupt, but each time I calmly pulled up another bylaw. Each one I had personally written, proving exactly how she had broken them. When she realized half the room was recording everything on their phones, she made one last attempt. "This is all hearsay. I demand to see the original bylaws." She thought she had me there. Most HOAs lose track of their original documents over time. Lucky for us, I had kept every single version with detailed notes. I projected my final slide, a scanned copy of the original bylaws with my signature and notary stamp. Article 7, Section 3. No board member shall selectively enforce these bylaws for personal gain or vendetta. I smiled. I added that after our last power-hungry president tried something similar. The vote was unanimous. Karen was removed from the board, along with Susan and 2 other members who had helped her scheme. The new board's first order of business? Approving Mrs. Chen's memorial bench, with a small garden around it, planted by the neighbors the following weekend. With Karen officially removed from power, the mood in the neighborhood shifted almost overnight. The tension that had settled over the community for months seemed to lift as people finally felt free to enjoy their homes without the constant threat of fines and harassment. The new HOA board wasted no time correcting Karen's mess, starting with a full audit of the HOA's finances. Bob, now promoted to HOA president, led the charge, and the results were worse than anyone expected. Thousands of dollars had been misallocated under vague maintenance expenses, but no one could find records of where the money had actually gone. More concerning, many of the fines Karen had issued were never deposited into the HOA's official accounts. The trail led straight to her personal bank records, revealing that she had funneled a significant portion of the money into a business owned by her brother. That was all the proof we needed to take legal action. Meanwhile, Karen's downfall had become the talk of the neighborhood. Her once loyal friends, Susan and Linda, were nowhere to be seen, likely distancing themselves from the inevitable consequences. Karen herself had retreated from public view, though her car was still in the driveway, meaning she hadn't skipped town just yet. I figured it was only a matter of time before she made her next move. Sure enough, a week later, I received an official-looking envelope in the mail. Karen was suing me for defamation. I couldn't help but laugh. If she thought she could intimidate me with legal threats, she had clearly forgotten who she was dealing with. I had spent years practicing law, and I knew exactly how flimsy her case was. Even better, her own signature was on most of the documents proving her misconduct. That same afternoon, Bob called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss our next steps. The community center was packed once again, but this time, the atmosphere was lighter, filled with an energy of determination rather than fear. Bob laid out the details of Karen's financial misconduct for everyone to see. There were gasps as he revealed that some of the missing funds had been used to renovate her backyard, on top of the illegal land expansion she had already attempted. I took the floor next, presenting the legal violations she had committed by bypassing election procedures and enforcing fabricated bylaws. As I spoke, I could see the anger growing among the residents. For months, they had suffered under Karen's rule, and now they saw just how deep her corruption ran. The vote was unanimous. The HOA would not only file a civil suit against Karen, but we would also push for a full criminal investigation into her misuse of funds. As soon as the meeting ended, Bob and I wasted no time drafting the necessary documents. With the overwhelming amount of evidence we had, the case against Karen was solid. But just as we finalized the paperwork, we received word from Lisa, the county clerk. Karen had just listed her house for sale. It was clear she was trying to leave before the consequences caught up with her. Unfortunately for her, she had overlooked one small detail. Her home was still in violation of multiple HOA bylaws. Before she could sell, she would have to repaint her garish purple trim and remove the illegal backyard additions. The irony was almost too perfect. After all the misery she had caused by enforcing rules selectively, she was now trapped by the very same regulations she had used to control others. But Karen wasn't done fighting just yet. Later that night, a car pulled up in front of my house, and I saw Karen storming toward my front door. My security camera caught everything as she pounded on the door, demanding that I drop the charges. I let her rant for a full 2 minutes before opening the door with my phone in hand, silently recording every word. Her threats, her accusations, her desperate attempts to spin the situation in her favor. It was all documented. When she finally realized what was happening, she turned pale and stumbled back. That's when I spoke. You just threatened legal action against a private resident while standing on their property. That's an additional violation of HOA policies, and I'll be sure to bring it up at the next meeting. Her face twisted in rage, but she knew she had lost. Without another word, she stormed back to her car and sped off. As I watched her leave, I knew this fight wasn't quite over yet. But I also knew one thing for sure. Karen was running out of moves, and soon, she would have no choice but to face the full weight of the consequences coming her way. Karen's desperation became more obvious as the days passed. She was running out of time, and with every move she made, she only buried herself deeper. The HOA's lawsuit had gained momentum, and the local news had picked up the story, exposing the extent of her corruption. Once the financial discrepancies were revealed, the authorities took notice, and an official investigation into HOA fund mismanagement was launched. Meanwhile, Karen still hadn't repainted her house, nor had she removed the illegal backyard additions, meaning she was stuck. She couldn't sell her home until the violations were resolved, and she couldn't afford the repairs with her assets frozen under legal scrutiny. She tried to push back, filing complaints against the HOA and even attempting to discredit me with false allegations. But none of it worked. The evidence was stacked against her, and every attempt she made to manipulate the situation only solidified the case against her. The neighborhood, once divided under her rule, had come together stronger than ever. Residents who had been too afraid to speak up before now openly defied her, refusing to acknowledge the fines she had imposed and even restoring the very things she had banned. Mrs. Chen's memorial bench now sat proudly in the park, surrounded by fresh flowers planted by volunteers. Kids played basketball in their driveways without fear of being fined. Even the community pool had been reopened after emergency funds were allocated to fix the filter, a filter that had mysteriously remained unfixed under Karen's leadership. But Karen wasn't ready to back down completely. A week before her court date, she made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Late one evening, Bob called me with an urgent update. Karen had sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA board, claiming that the lawsuit against her was based on personal vendettas and that she would sue everyone involved for defamation. I couldn't help but laugh. The legal argument was laughably weak, and she clearly didn't realize that half the people she was threatening were already part of an active case against her. Still, I wasn't going to let my guard down. I spent the next few days making sure every single document, witness statement, and financial record was in order. When the court date finally arrived, Karen showed up looking visibly exhausted, her once perfectly styled hair now disheveled, her usual arrogance dulled by the reality of the situation. Her lawyer did his best to argue her case, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge didn't even need long to deliberate. The ruling was clear. Karen was found guilty of financial misconduct, and she was ordered to repay every cent she had stolen. On top of that, she was permanently banned from holding any position within an HOA, meaning she could never abuse power in a community like this again. But the real victory came when the court addressed her attempts to sue me and the other homeowners. The judge dismissed her claims entirely, even warning her that further frivolous lawsuits could result in additional fines. As I left the courtroom, I saw Karen sitting alone, staring blankly at the paperwork in her hands. It was over. She had spent months terrorizing the neighborhood, believing she was untouchable. But in the end, she had fallen victim to the very rules she had tried to manipulate. When I returned home that evening, the entire neighborhood was gathered at the community center, celebrating the victory. The atmosphere was filled with laughter, relief, and a sense of unity that had been missing for far too long. Bob raised a toast to new beginnings, and Mrs. Chun, for the first time in months, smiled without worry. Looking around at my neighbors, I realized something. Karen may have ruled with fear, but in the end, she had only made the community stronger. And as for me, Well, I had one last thing to do. I went home, framed Whisker's honorary HOA inspector certificate, and placed it right next to my law degree. Karen's house sat untouched for weeks, a silent reminder of her downfall. With no way to sell it until the HOA violations were resolved and her financial troubles mounting. She had no choice but to comply with the very rules she had once weaponized. The bright purple trim was finally repainted to an HOA-approved shade of gray, a fitting color considering her situation. The illegal backyard expansion was removed, restoring the community green space she had tried to claim as her own. But by the time the house was back in compliance, Karen was gone. She had packed up and left town, vanishing without so much as a goodbye. No one was surprised. The neighborhood had already moved on, stronger than ever. The new HOA board, now filled with people who actually cared about the community, worked to undo the damage she had caused. The absurd fines were rescinded, and the bylaws were reinforced to prevent anyone from abusing power the way Karen had. The financial investigation revealed even more hidden misconduct, leading to additional legal action against Karen and her associates. But for the rest of us, it was over. The community had reclaimed what was rightfully ours. As for me, I finally had peace. No more violation notices taped to my door, no more secret HOA meetings, no more legal battles against a power-hungry tyrant. I could finally sit on my porch, sip my coffee, and enjoy my home without interference. And so, could everyone else? Mrs. Chen's bench remained in place, now surrounded by a small memorial garden tended by the neighbors. Bob continued his role as HOA president, ensuring fairness and transparency in every decision. The community pool, once closed due to Karen's mismanagement, was now thriving, filled with laughter and life again. Even the children, once afraid of being fined for playing outside, roamed freely, their basketball hoops standing tall in driveways where they belonged. One evening, as I relaxed with a book, Whiskers curled up beside me, content as ever. I glanced at his framed honorary HOA inspector certificate on the wall and smirked. Of all the things Karen had tried to control, it had been my cat that ultimately unraveled everything. If only she had known that a $500 fine over an exotic pet would be the beginning of her downfall. In the end, karma had done what it always does. It came back around with claws sharper than ever. Something fell off. It started with unfamiliar cars slowing near my barn, lingering just long enough to make me uneasy. Shadowy figures watching from a distance, barely visible, but present enough to send a chill down my spine. Then came the sirens. I knew right away that HOA Karen was behind this, but even in my worst nightmares, I never expected what was coming. She had decided that my land, my farm, the only thing keeping me afloat, should belong to her. Not because she had any legal right to it, not because she wanted to buy it, but simply because she believed she could take whatever she wanted. But she didn't realize something important. I wasn't about to let her walk all over me. What followed was a battle she never saw coming. Before we get into this complete roller coaster of insanity, let me tell you right now, this was a fight like no other. What happened to me is happening to people every single day, and if no one speaks up, it will continue to happen in silence. My name is Peter Myers, and I am a farmer. I don't live a luxurious life. Every day is a struggle to put food on the table and keep things running. My land is not just property, it's my survival. Every morning, before the sun even rises, I tend to my animals, work the fields, and pray that the weather will be on my side. Farming isn't just something I do, it's who I am. It's in my blood, passed down through generations. But none of that mattered to Karen. HOA Karen, the self-proclaimed ruler of her pristine little neighborhood, ran her community like a queen sitting on a throne. She dictated every little detail, from the color of mailboxes to the exact height of fences. But her control had limits, and I was that limit. My farm sat just outside her neighborhood, completely outside the HOA's jurisdiction. But to her, my land was an eyesore. Not because it was unkempt or rundown, no, that would have at least made sense. Karen had a much bigger scheme in mind. She wanted to build an incinerator, a massive facility designed to burn trash at extreme temperatures, and my land was the perfect location. Now, let me explain exactly what that means. An incinerator isn't just an inconvenience. It's a death sentence for a farm. The smoke alone would poison the air, the fumes would destroy my crops, and the noise would drive my animals into a frenzy. But Karen didn't care. To her, it was the perfect setup. She could keep her neighborhood spotless and odor-free while dumping all the filth onto me. In her mind, she had already decided that my land belonged to her. But instead of offering to buy it or discussing any kind of deal, she went straight to intimidation. At first, it was letters, fake legal documents printed on official-looking HOA stationery, demanding that I consider the good of the community. I ignored them. Then came the vague threats, warnings that my land could be deemed a health hazard if I didn't comply. I still refused to budge. Karen wasn't just trying to pressure me. She was trying to break me. But what she didn't understand was that I wasn't the kind of man who backed down. I had poured everything I had into this land, and I wasn't about to let some entitled woman take it away just because she felt like it. She thought she could push me into a corner, but she had no idea what I was capable of. One morning, I stepped outside to feed my animals, only to be met with a sight that made my blood run cold. A police car sat parked just outside my barn. Then another, and another. My chest tightened as I watched officers step out, scanning my property like they were investigating a crime scene. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but deep down, I already knew. Karen had escalated. She wasn't just playing her usual HOA games anymore. She was going for a full-scale attack. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself forward, my fists clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. This was my land, and I wasn't about to let them take it without a fight. My heart pounded as I stepped forward, trying to keep my voice steady while my insides burned with frustration. The lead officer, a stocky man with cold, calculating eyes, barely glanced at me before speaking in a clipped tone, informing me that they had received reports about unauthorized property use. My stomach dropped. Unauthorized property use on my own land? The words felt so absurd that I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about this situation. I squared my shoulders, my voice firm as I told them that this land had never been part of the HOA, that I owned it free and clear. The officer barely reacted, instead flipping through a stack of papers before stating that they had reason to believe it had recently been annexed under the HOA's jurisdiction. My blood ran cold. This was beyond harassment. This was a blatant power move. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm as I demanded to see proof. The officer's expression remained unreadable, and instead of producing any real evidence, he simply told me to step aside while they conducted their assessment. That was when the panic truly set in. I had heard stories before, stories of people losing their land to corrupt organizations who buried them in legal loopholes and red tape until they had no way out. But I never thought it would happen to me. I wasn't going to just stand there and let them walk all over me. My voice rose as I demanded to know who had given them this ridiculous information. The hesitation in the officer's stance gave him away before he even spoke. Karen. Of course it was her. My fists clenched at my sides as I took a step closer, my entire body trembling with fury. This wasn't just about zoning disputes or HOA policies anymore. This was an attempt to steal my land outright. The younger officer, standing slightly behind the lead, looked away uncomfortably, his expression almost apologetic. For a brief second, I thought maybe I could reason with him. But before I could say anything, the stocky officer shut it down, stating that if I refused to cooperate, they would have no choice but to take further action. My patience snapped. I had spent months dealing with Karen's nonsense, brushing off her threats, ignoring her letters, thinking she would eventually back down. But this was different. This was my home, my livelihood, and I was done playing nice. If they wanted to arrest me for standing on my own land, they could try. My voice rang through the air as I shouted that I wasn't going anywhere, that they could charge me with whatever fabricated nonsense they wanted, but I wasn't backing down. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in the lead officer's eyes. He wasn't expecting me to fight back. He was expecting fear, submission, maybe even desperation, but not defiance. This wasn't just Karen wanting my land anymore. This was about power. She wanted complete control. And if she couldn't manipulate me into surrendering, she was going to force me out in any way she could. She had already tried using legal pressure, twisting zoning laws, filing complaints, but when that failed, she escalated. She brought in the police, hoping their presence would intimidate me into submission. But she still didn't understand who she was dealing with. I wasn't just going to roll over and let her take everything I had built. She thought she had all the power, but what she didn't realize was that she had just started a fight she wasn't ready for. Karen had lost the legal battle, but she wasn't done. If she couldn't take my land with fake documents and intimidation, she was going to destroy me another way. The police eventually left, unable to find a single legitimate reason to enforce their so-called assessment. But that didn't mean Karen had given up. She switched to a different weapon: social sabotage. It started small, just whispers in the grocery store, little snippets of conversation that I barely caught as I walked past. People who used to greet me with a nod or a smile suddenly looked away. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard the rumors. Karen had been planting seeds of doubt, twisting the story until I became the villain. I heard claims that I was refusing to comply with community safety standards, that I was hoarding dangerous materials in my barn, that I was threatening the stability of the neighborhood. It didn't matter that none of it was true. Karen knew exactly how to manipulate people. And just like that, my neighbors, people I had known for years, started pulling away. It wasn't just the cold shoulders and judgmental stares. My farm depended on the local community, on people buying my produce, my dairy, my eggs. But then the orders started disappearing. Longtime customers who had always supported me suddenly stopped coming. The local store, which had stocked my fresh produce for years, suddenly found new suppliers and had no space for my goods anymore. My income began to dry up, my once steady business crumbling right in front of me. I reached out, trying to understand why. I asked people I had known for years if something was wrong, but the responses were always vague, awkward. "You know how things are," one person muttered before quickly walking away. "I don't want any trouble," another one said, not even making eye contact. Trouble? I was the one under attack. Karen had twisted the story so much that people genuinely believed I was the problem, that I was the one making life difficult for the neighborhood. Meanwhile, she sat back, watching the destruction unfold like some queen playing a sick game. Every day, I watched as my sales dropped lower and lower. Bills started piling up, and I was struggling to pay the workers who helped me keep the farm running. I saw the worry in their eyes, and I had no answers for them. What was I supposed to say? That one entitled woman had decided to destroy my entire livelihood because she couldn't get what she wanted? At night, I barely slept, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I felt trapped, watching my future slip away, and for the first time since this started, I wondered if maybe Karen was winning. But then something inside me changed. Why should I be the one to suffer? Why should I be the one to lose everything while she sat comfortably in her home, enjoying the chaos she had created? No, I wasn't backing down. If Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one. I wasn't going to let Karen run me into the ground without a fight. If she wanted to play dirty, I was ready to hit back twice as hard. The first thing I did was document everything, every fake HOA notice, every police visit, every rumor she spread about me. I needed proof, and I wasn't about to let her slither out of this when the time came to expose her. The second thing I did was reach out to people who weren't under her thumb. Not everyone in town believed her lies, and I needed allies if I was going to turn this around. I started reconnecting with old customers, explaining what had really happened. Some of them had been hesitant at first, worried about getting involved, but once they realized the truth, they were furious. They had been manipulated, tricked into thinking I was the problem, and now they were ready to fight back. But even that wasn't enough. Karen had poisoned the entire neighborhood against me, and the only way to counter that was to hit her where it hurt, her reputation. So I did something she never saw coming. I went to the media. It started with a small local paper, one that wasn't under Karen's influence. I laid everything out. The fake HOA documents, the attempts to annex my land, the way she had turned an entire town against a single person out of pure spite. The journalist listened carefully, taking notes, asking for copies of everything. Then, as I was leaving, he told me something that sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't the first person Karen had done this to. Apparently, there had been others before me. Homeowners who had been forced out, landowners who had suddenly found themselves drowning in fines and legal threats until they had no choice but to leave. The difference was none of them had fought back. That was about to change. The first article dropped a week later, and it hit like a wrecking ball. The headline alone was enough to shake people. Local HOA accused of fraud and harassment. It detailed everything Karen had done, not just to me, but to others as well. And once the truth was out, people started talking. Suddenly, neighbors who had been afraid to speak up before were coming forward with their own horror stories. A couple down the road told me they had been fined thousands of dollars for a minor fence violation. Another family said they had received eviction threats because their mailbox was the wrong shade of brown. The floodgates had opened, and Karen was no longer in control of the narrative. But the real turning point came when a larger news outlet picked up the story. It spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with people calling out Karen's corruption, demanding action. People from outside the town started sharing similar stories about HOAs abusing their power. And suddenly, this wasn't just about me. It was about a system that had gone unchecked for too long. Karen had spent years ruling with an iron fist, convinced that no one could stop her. But now, she was the one on the defensive. As more articles rolled out, the HOA board started to crumble. Some members resigned immediately, trying to escape the fallout. Others turned on Karen, claiming they had been forced into decisions they never agreed with. The town council, which had ignored complaints for years, suddenly had no choice but to take action. Karen's empire was falling apart right in front of her, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't untouchable. Karen had spent years manipulating people, bending the rules to her advantage, and intimidating anyone who dared to stand in her way. But she had never faced real opposition before, and now that she was cornered, she started making desperate moves. First, she tried to play the victim, releasing a statement claiming that she had only ever acted in the best interest of the community. She painted me as an aggressor, accusing me of spreading false accusations and damaging the HOA's reputation. But the damage had already been done. The media wasn't buying it, and neither were the people in town. Too many stories had surfaced, too much evidence had been revealed. Every attempt she made to shift the blame only made her look worse. Then, she tried to silence me legally. A cease and desist letter arrived at my farm, demanding that I stop speaking about the HOA or risk legal action. I took one look at it and laughed. It had no legal standing, no actual power behind it. It was just another scare tactic. I handed it over to my lawyer, who advised me to ignore it completely. Karen had always controlled people through fear, but that fear was gone now. She had lost her grip, and she knew it. But she wasn't done yet. When legal threats failed, she turned to sabotage. Strange things started happening around my farm. My fences were mysteriously cut overnight, letting my livestock wander dangerously close to the road. Equipment went missing, only to be found dumped miles away. My water supply was tampered with, forcing me to spend hours fixing pipes that had never had issues before. It was obvious who was behind it, but I needed proof. So I set up security cameras around the property, making sure every angle was covered. And then one night, I caught her. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to show Karen sneaking onto my land with a pair of wire cutters in hand. That was all I needed. The next morning, I took the footage straight to the sheriff's office. The moment Karen was confronted with the evidence, her entire facade crumbled. She had no excuse, no way to spin it in her favor. She was caught red-handed, and this time, there was no escaping the consequences. The sheriff wasn't just interested in trespassing charges. With everything that had come to light, the fraudulent documents, the intimidation tactics, the blatant abuse of power, the authorities had enough to launch a full investigation into the HOA's dealings. Karen wasn't just facing fines or a slap on the wrist. She was looking at real legal consequences. As the case against her grew, her support disappeared. The few remaining HOA board members who had stood by her quickly distanced themselves, some even testifying against her in exchange for reduced penalties. The entire neighborhood, once terrified of speaking out, was now demanding justice. The community that she had controlled for so long had finally turned against her. Karen had built her empire on lies, fear, and manipulation, but in the end, all of it had collapsed under the weight of the truth. With Karen's downfall accelerating, the full weight of her actions began catching up to her. The sheriff's department, now armed with my security footage and a mountain of testimonies, launched an official criminal investigation. It wasn't just about her trespassing anymore. Authorities uncovered years of financial mismanagement, fraudulent fines, and illegal property seizures. Homeowners who had been too scared to speak out finally came forward, revealing how Karen had used HOA funds for personal expenses, manipulated property values to push out those she didn't like, and issued bogus violations to bully people into compliance. The deeper they dug, the worse it got. Investigators found proof that she had been pocketing money from HOA dues, funneling it into her personal bank accounts while claiming it was for neighborhood improvements. She had been running a full-blown racket, treating the HOA like her personal business, and now there was no hiding from it. The town, once divided by her lies, had fully turned against her. Every meeting she tried to hold was flooded with angry homeowners demanding answers, shouting for justice. But Karen had lost control, and for the first time, she had no way to silence them. Then came the final blow. A local news station, which had been following the scandal from the beginning, aired an in-depth investigative report exposing every corrupt detail. They laid it all out: the fraudulent land grab, the police harassment, the financial crimes. They even interviewed some of the families she had wronged, giving them a platform to tell their stories. The broadcast went viral, spreading far beyond our town, turning Karen into a public disgrace. Online forums exploded with outrage, military veterans and farmers across the country weighing in, condemning what she had done. The pressure on the town council became unbearable, and they had no choice but to step in. An emergency vote was held, and within days, the HOA was officially disbanded. The once feared organization that had ruled with an iron fist was gone, wiped out in the span of a few weeks. But for Karen, things were far from over. A warrant was issued for her arrest on multiple charges, including fraud, embezzlement, and trespassing. The woman who had once acted like she was untouchable was now being led out of her house in handcuffs, her face plastered across every news station in the state. As I watched from a distance, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Karen had spent years making people suffer, abusing her power, thinking she was above the law. But in the end, justice had caught up to her. My land was safe, my farm still stood, and the nightmare she had created was finally over. The town had learned a valuable lesson. Unchecked power always leads to corruption, and when people stand together, no tyrant can last forever. But even as Karen disappeared into the back of a police car, I knew this wasn't just about her. This was about every corrupt HOA, every power-hungry official who thought they could get away with anything. And as I walked back onto my land, knowing it was truly mine once more, I realized that sometimes standing your ground isn't just about survival. It's about making sure no one else has to fight the same battle ever again. With Karen out of the picture and the HOA officially dismantled, the town had a chance to rebuild without fear. The community that had once been divided under her rule was finally coming together. And for the first time in years, people could make decisions about their own homes without worrying about absurd fines or fabricated violations. Former HOA members who had blindly followed Karen's orders were now trying to repair their reputations, but the damage had been done. They had stood by and allowed her to abuse her power for years, and no one was eager to forgive them. Meanwhile, the town council announced a complete audit of every fine and foreclosure the HOA had issued over the past decade, and what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Karen hadn't just been abusing her authority. She had been running a full-scale operation, illegally seizing properties, inflating fees, and threatening homeowners into silence. It was theft, plain and simple, and now every victim had a chance to fight back. Lawsuits started piling up against Karen and her remaining supporters, and as the legal battles dragged on, it became clear that she would be paying for her crimes for the rest of her life. As for me, I was finally able to return to my normal life. My farm, once the target of Karen's obsession, was thriving again. The customers who had been manipulated into avoiding my business came back, apologizing for believing the lies. I held no grudges against them. They had been victims of Karen's control, just like everyone else. What mattered was that the truth had prevailed, and I could finally focus on what I loved without constantly looking over my shoulder. But the most unexpected thing was how my story had spread far beyond our small town. People from all over the country reached out, sharing their own horror stories about corrupt HOAs and power-hungry officials who had tried to take what wasn't theirs. Some asked for advice. Others just wanted to thank me for standing up and proving that these organizations weren't untouchable. It was overwhelming, but it also made me realize something important. This wasn't just my fight. There were people everywhere dealing with the same kind of abuse, and for too long, they had felt powerless to stop it. One afternoon, as I stood by my fence, looking out over the land I had nearly lost, I knew I couldn't just walk away from this. I had won my battle, but there were others still fighting, and if my experience could help them, then I had a responsibility to share it. I started speaking out, joining online forums, connecting with homeowner advocacy groups, and helping others navigate the same kind of legal nightmare I had endured. What had once been an exhausting, bitter war had turned into something meaningful, a way to ensure that no one else would have to go through what I did alone. Karen had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, she had only made me stronger. She had thought she was unstoppable, but she had underestimated the one thing more powerful than fear: people who refused to be controlled. And as I watched the sun set over my farm, standing on the land that was truly mine, I knew that no matter how many Karens existed in the world, they would never win as long as people were willing to fight back. With everything finally behind me, life slowly returned to normal. The town, once under the tight grip of Karen's rule, had transformed into a place where people could live without fear. The HOA, which had once been the ultimate authority, was nothing more than a bad memory. Homeowners who had been bullied for years finally had their voices heard, and those who had lost their homes unfairly were taking legal action to reclaim what had been stolen. The system Karen built had completely collapsed, and she was left to face the consequences of her greed. Her legal battles were far from over, and with every new charge brought against her, it became clear that she would never regain the power she once had. The woman who had spent her life controlling others was now at the mercy of the very system she had abused, and there was no one left to protect her. But for me, this fight had never been about revenge. It had been about justice, about standing my ground against someone who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. I had won, not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever been steamrolled by a corrupt HOA. As the weeks passed, I focused on rebuilding what Karen had tried to destroy. My farm was thriving again, and the support from the community was stronger than ever. The people who had once been afraid to speak out now stood together, determined to never let someone like Karen hold power over them again. I had spent so much time fighting to protect my land that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to just live without worry. But standing out there in the open fields, watching the sun rise over the land that was rightfully mine, I finally felt at peace. Karen had tried to break me, but instead, she had only proven something I had always known. When you fight for what is right, you will always come out stronger. As I leaned against the fence, feeling the warmth of the morning sun, I knew that no matter what challenges came next, I was ready. Because now, I wasn't just a farmer who had defended his home. I was someone who had proven that no matter how powerful the enemy seems, they can always be brought down. And that, more than anything, was a victory worth remembering. Life is a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. My name is Matthew Carter, and this is the story of how my brother's house was ripped away from him while he was serving his country overseas, and how I made sure those responsible paid the price. My brother, Logan Carter, had always been the kind of person who stepped up when others hesitated. As a kid, he would carry groceries for the elderly, mow lawns without expecting payment, and believed in helping his community no matter what. That same sense of duty led him straight into the military, where he quickly rose through the ranks, earning commendations for his dedication and service. Despite the dangers, he never once complained about his deployments. He saw his fellow soldiers as family, bound together by experiences most could never understand. Eventually, after years of careful saving and planning, Logan bought himself a modest 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't flashy, 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, and a cozy living room. But to him, it was everything. A symbol of stability. A piece of home. I still remember the excitement in his voice the day he called me, standing on his new porch with the keys in hand, calling it our place, even though I didn't live there. That was Logan, always generous, always thinking of others. Before his next deployment, he ensured everything was in order. His mortgage was set to auto-pay, his bills were covered, and he gave me power of attorney just in case anything needed handling in his absence. We both assumed everything would be smooth sailing. But life doesn't always work that way. The nightmare began with a phone call from our mother. It was early evening, and I had just gotten off work, sitting in my car, scrolling through messages when the phone rang. Her voice was trembling, something I had rarely heard before. Matthew, they sold Logan's house. My heart slammed against my ribcage. What do you mean, they sold his house? The words barely formed as my throat tightened, dread creeping in. The HOA, she whispered, her voice hollow. They put it up for auction. At that moment, I didn't even know how to react. My mother wasn't someone who panicked easily, so if she was scared, it meant the situation was dire. Without wasting another second, I gripped my keys and drove straight to Logan's house, my mind racing with questions. How could a fully paid mortgage, with no missed payments, be sold? It had to be a mistake, a clerical error. There was no other explanation. But as I turned onto Logan Street, the sight that greeted me confirmed my worst fears. A moving truck sat in the driveway, its back panel rolled up, revealing Logan's belongings being hauled out like discarded junk. His couch, his TV, the wooden shelf where he displayed his military plaques. All of it being handled by strangers with no regard for the memories attached. My stomach churned with rage. I parked behind the truck and stormed out, barely able to keep my composure. And then I saw her, Samantha Turner, the HOA president. She stood on the porch, clipboard in hand, barking orders at the moving crew like she was orchestrating some grand production. I had met her once before. Logan had mentioned her in passing, complaining about her nitpicking ways. She was the kind of person who left aggressive notes about trash bins being an inch out of place and seemed to thrive on controlling the neighborhood. But never in my wildest dreams did I think she would be capable of something like this. Samantha Turner turned around slowly, a smirk forming on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the kind of expression that made my blood boil, the smug confidence of someone who thought they were untouchable. "Mr. Carter, I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. My fists clenched at my sides, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What the hell is going on here?" My voice shook, not from fear, but from the sheer rage bubbling beneath the surface. Samantha let out a dramatic sigh, flipping through the pages on her clipboard with exaggerated slowness. "This property was auctioned off last week due to unpaid HOA fees," she said, feigning boredom. The words didn't make sense. Unpaid HOA fees? Logan was meticulous with his bills, especially anything tied to his house. He had everything automated to avoid even the slightest issue. "That's impossible," I shot back, my voice firm. "My brother is deployed overseas, and his mortgage is paid automatically. He doesn't owe you anything." Samantha arched an eyebrow, as if I were merely amusing her with my protest. "Actually," she said, dragging the word out, "he violated HOA policy by leaving the house unoccupied for over 6 months without filing the required absence paperwork. That's considered abandonment under our rules." I stared at her, struggling to comprehend the absurdity of what I had just heard. "Abandonment?" I repeated, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. "He's not some deadbeat who skipped town. He's serving his country." But Samantha only shrugged, her smirk widening. "The law is the law," she said coldly, as if those words excused the sheer cruelty of what she had done. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned to the police officer standing nearby. "You're just going to let this happen?" I demanded, my voice raw with disbelief. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "It's a civil matter, sir. If you have an issue, you'll need to take it to court." My stomach dropped. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a calculated move, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They had found a loophole, exploited it, and were now trying to act as if they had done nothing wrong. And the worst part? They were confident they'd get away with it. I had no choice but to walk away that day, but I wasn't giving up, not by a long shot. I went home, my mind spinning with everything I had just witnessed. The moment I walked through my door, I threw myself into research. I spread out Logan's mortgage documents, bank statements, and HOA letters across my dining table, determined to find any flaw in their reasoning. My brother had done everything right, yet his home had still been taken from him. And that's when I noticed something strange. Hidden in the fine print of the HOA's bylaws were repeated fines for things that made no sense. They had claimed Logan's lawn was neglected, despite him having a landscaping service. They had fined him for having a security camera, even though half the neighborhood had the exact same system installed. These fines weren't just excessive, they were targeted. I clenched my jaw, my hands gripping the papers so tightly they crumpled. This wasn't just about Logan anymore. I barely slept that night, my mind racing through every possible way to fight back against the HOA. This wasn't just about Logan's house anymore. This was about exposing the corruption that had allowed this to happen in the first place. By morning, I had already started making calls. First, I contacted the mortgage company, confirming that Logan's payments had been up to date with no missed transactions. Then, I dug into the Service Members Civil Relief Act, a federal law designed to protect deployed military personnel from exactly this kind of situation. What I found made my blood boil. Under the law, an active duty service member's property could not be foreclosed upon or sold without extensive legal procedures, including a requirement to notify both the service member and their mortgage lender. The HOA had ignored these protections entirely, acting as if they had absolute power over Logan's home. But the worst discovery was yet to come. The so-called auction that had taken place was nothing more than a sham. The buyer? None other than Samantha Turner's cousin. The house had been sold at a fraction of its value, a clear case of insider dealing. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't a one-time event. This was a system they had perfected over time. They targeted homeowners who were away for long periods, imposed fabricated fines, and forced foreclosures, all to seize properties and resell them at rock-bottom prices to their own connections. It was a textbook case of fraud. That's when I knew I needed professional help. I spent the next few hours calling lawyers, explaining the situation. Most of them sympathized, but many told me this would be a long and expensive battle. Some outright refused to take on an HOA, warning that these cases often got tied up in bureaucracy. I was starting to lose hope until a friend referred me to an attorney named Adrian Callahan, a man known for taking on corrupt HOAs and winning. His office was in a modest building, cluttered with legal books, case files, and coffee cups, and his reputation was that of a bulldog, relentless and fearless. The moment I stepped into his office and laid out the case, he didn't hesitate. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk forming as he tapped his pen against his desk. "This isn't just bad," he said, "this is illegal as hell." Those words were all I needed to hear. He immediately started drafting an emergency injunction to freeze the sale of Logan's house, preventing any further transfers of ownership. This was the first step in dismantling the HOA scam. But I wasn't satisfied with just legal action. If the law moved too slowly, I was going to make sure this story reached as many people as possible. That's when I turned to the media, reaching out to military advocacy groups, veterans organizations, and local news outlets. If Samantha and her corrupt board thought they could get away with this quietly, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The moment Adrian filed the emergency injunction, I wasted no time taking the fight to the next level. If the legal process was going to take time, then I would make sure the entire world knew what this HOA had done. I started reaching out to military advocacy groups, veterans organizations, and local news outlets, detailing how a homeowners association had illegally auctioned off the house of a deployed soldier. At first, a few small outlets picked up the story, but it didn't take long before the outrage started spreading. Military families across the country were furious, and social media exploded with people demanding justice. Headlines began appearing, each one more damning than the last, exposing how Logan's home had been stolen under a fraudulent loophole, all while he was overseas defending the very freedoms these HOA members took for granted. Samantha Turner and her board were about to face the kind of scrutiny they never expected. Meanwhile, Adrian was already preparing for the next step. He filed for a lawsuit citing violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, fraud, and illegal foreclosure. The evidence against the HOA was overwhelming. Not only had they failed to notify Logan or his mortgage lender, but they had also engaged in what could only be described as a predatory scheme to steal homes under false pretenses. The judge granted a temporary freeze on any ownership changes, meaning Logan's house couldn't be sold again or modified while the case was ongoing. That was a small victory, but I wanted more. I wanted them exposed. I decided to personally deliver the court order to the HOA office. Walking into their headquarters, I felt a rush of satisfaction as I slammed the legal documents onto Samantha's desk. She barely looked up, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. For the first time, she wasn't in control, and she knew it. "See you in court," I muttered, keeping my voice steady. Samantha didn't say a word, just tightened her grip on her pen and glanced at the papers. But I wasn't done yet. If they thought they could handle this quietly, they were in for a rude awakening. I started contacting every major news station, military forums, and social media pages that focused on veterans' rights. Within days, the story had gone viral. It wasn't just about Logan anymore. This was about every deployed service member who could be at risk of losing their home to a corrupt HOA. The pressure was mounting, and Samantha's smug attitude started to crack. Neighbors began questioning what else the HOA had done behind closed doors. Reports started surfacing about similar cases, where homeowners had been unfairly fined, threatened with foreclosure, and even forced out under shady legal loopholes. The dominoes were falling fast. The court date was set, and as the pressure continued to rise, it was clear that Samantha and her HOA board were running out of ways to escape the truth. As the court date approached, the weight of the case started pressing down on the HOA. What they had assumed would be a quiet, uncontested foreclosure had turned into a nationwide scandal. The more the media covered it, the worse it got for them. Military families, veterans, and even active-duty personnel flooded social media with their outrage, demanding accountability. Some even dug into the HOA's past, uncovering that this wasn't the first time they had used questionable tactics against homeowners. Their reputation was crumbling, and Samantha Turner could no longer ignore the storm heading her way. Adrian and I spent countless hours compiling every piece of evidence, making sure that when we entered that courtroom, there would be no way for them to twist the facts. We had mortgage statements proving Logan had never missed a payment, deployment orders showing he was protected under federal law, and documentation revealing how the HOA had manipulated the system to declare his house abandoned. But that wasn't all. Witness testimonies started coming in. Neighbors who had seen the moving truck that day, people who had been pressured by the HOA, and even former board members who admitted that Samantha had been using her position to push through illegal sales. The case wasn't just strong, it was bulletproof. Then came the unexpected twist. A day before the trial, an anonymous tip landed in Adrian's inbox. An email thread between Samantha and other board members, explicitly detailing how they planned to exploit homeowners who couldn't fight back. The messages were damning. In one, Samantha arrogantly boasted about how easy it was to take over properties when the owners were absent, stating that they'll never see it coming. Another message confirmed that Logan's case had been planned well in advance, with a deliberate strategy to rush the auction before anyone could intervene. This was the final nail in their coffin. With this new evidence, Adrian pushed for an even stronger case, adding further charges of fraudulent intent. The night before the trial, I received a call from an unknown number. I answered, and a familiar voice spoke on the other end. It was Samantha Turner. Gone was her usual smug tone. Instead, she sounded panicked, desperate. She tried to negotiate, suggesting a quiet settlement to resolve things without dragging it out. I didn't even let her finish. There was nothing to discuss. This wasn't just about Logan anymore. This was about justice. "See you in court," I said before hanging up. The next morning, as I walked into the courthouse, I knew one thing for certain. No matter what tricks they had left, they were about to face the consequences of their corruption. The courtroom was packed, filled with reporters, military families, neighbors, and even people who had been following the case online. Samantha Turner sat on the other side of the room, flanked by her attorney and a few other HOA board members. But the confidence she once carried was gone. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The judge wasted no time, immediately addressing the case and acknowledging the overwhelming public interest in the trial. Adrian stood up first, presenting the facts with precision. He laid out the clear violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, showing how Logan had been unlawfully targeted, how the HOA had completely ignored federal protections, and how the so-called auction was a fraudulent transaction benefiting Samantha's cousin. As each point was laid out, the judge's expression grew more serious. The evidence spoke for itself. Mortgage statements confirming Logan had never missed a payment, HOA records showing fabricated violations, and the newly discovered emails proving the entire scheme had been orchestrated deliberately. When it was time for the HOA's lawyer to respond, they tried to argue that they had followed state guidelines regarding abandoned properties, claiming they had no knowledge of Logan's military status. But Adrian was prepared. He presented emails between Logan and the HOA that explicitly mentioned his deployment, making it clear they had been fully aware. Then, he revealed the biggest blow of the case, the internal HOA emails that showed their deliberate plan to seize Logan's home. The courtroom went silent. Samantha's lawyer scrambled to object, but the damage was done. The judge leaned forward, reading through the emails himself, and then turned to Samantha directly. His voice was firm, cutting through the tense silence. The HOA had not only broken the law, but had done so with full knowledge of their actions, making this more than just negligence. It was fraud. Samantha's face was pale, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if trying to hold herself together. The HOA board members beside her looked equally panicked, some whispering to each other in hushed tones. Then came the judge's ruling. The foreclosure and sale of Logan's home were declared null and void, restoring full ownership to him immediately. But that wasn't all. The judge also ordered a full investigation into the HOA's practices, stating that this case alone was enough to warrant legal action against multiple individuals involved. The courtroom erupted, murmurs spreading through the audience as reporters rushed to document the verdict. Samantha and her lawyer tried to argue, but the judge wasn't interested in hearing any excuses. There would be no settlement, no quiet resolution. The HOA had played a dangerous game, and now they were paying the price. As I turned to look at Samantha one last time, I saw the reality of her downfall settling in. She had built her power on fear and control, but in the end, justice had caught up to her. The moment the gavel hit the desk, sealing the verdict, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was over. Logan's home was safe, and the people who had tried to steal it were about to face the full force of the law. But even as I walked out of that courtroom, I knew this wasn't just a personal victory. This was a message to every corrupt HOA out there that they weren't untouchable anymore. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but I knew this wasn't the end. The ruling had been a massive victory, but the fight wasn't just about Logan's house anymore. The judge's order for a full investigation meant that the entire HOA board was now under scrutiny, and as the legal process unfolded, the truth about their corruption was coming to light. Reporters wasted no time in digging deeper, uncovering that Logan wasn't the only victim. Over the years, Samantha and her board had targeted multiple homeowners, forcing them into foreclosure through fabricated fines and technicalities. People who had been too exhausted, financially drained, or unaware of their rights had lost their homes, and now, for the first time, they were coming forward. Lawsuits were being filed left and right, homeowners demanding justice, and Samantha Turner, once the untouchable ruler of the HOA, was now facing legal action that went far beyond our case. Adrian and I watched as the walls closed in around them. HOA board members started resigning, some trying to distance themselves from the scandal, while others outright admitted they had been part of the scheme, hoping for leniency in court. But the evidence was too strong. The fraudulent auction of Logan's home had been the tipping point, and now the entire operation was collapsing. Meanwhile, Logan, still overseas, was finally able to catch up on everything that had happened. When I spoke to him on the phone, there was a long silence as he processed it all. He had expected to return to a quiet home, but instead, he was coming back to a story that had shaken the entire community. But more than anything, he was grateful. Grateful that people had stood up for him, that justice had prevailed, and that he still had a home waiting for him. As the legal battle continued, the fallout spread beyond just our case. Local lawmakers began pushing for changes in HOA regulations, demanding stricter oversight and better protection for homeowners, especially military personnel. What had started as a personal fight had turned into something much bigger, and the thought of it made me realize just how many people had suffered under the unchecked power of corrupt HOAs. The public pressure on Samantha and her associates was relentless. Their assets were frozen, their powers stripped away, and they were now facing a court battle that would likely end in criminal charges. The smug, arrogant Samantha had once displayed was gone, replaced with desperation as she tried to navigate the consequences of her actions. But there was no way out. The damage she had done was irreversible, and for once, she was the one with no control over the situation. The neighborhood itself had changed too. The HOA, now under temporary management, was being restructured, and the fear that had once gripped homeowners had disappeared. People spoke freely, openly questioning policies that had gone unchallenged for years. The community had come together in a way no one had expected, and as I looked around, I realized that this fight had done more than just expose corruption. It had given people back their voice. But there was still one final moment left in this battle, the one that mattered the most. Logan was coming home, and this time, he wouldn't be walking into a stolen house or a broken neighborhood. He would be coming back to a community that had fought for him, and that was a victory far greater than anything I had imagined. The day Logan returned home was unlike anything I had ever seen. As I drove to the airport, I felt the weight of everything that had happened over the past few months. This had started as a desperate fight to save his home, but it had turned into something far bigger, a movement that exposed corruption and forced change. When I pulled up to the arrival section, I spotted Logan immediately. He looked exhausted but relieved, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder as he scanned the crowd. The moment he saw me, his expression shifted from uncertainty to a familiar grin, the same one he had when we were kids and had just pulled off some ridiculous prank. I stepped out of the car, and before I could say a word, he pulled me into a hug, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had happened. As we drove back, I tried to explain everything, the court battle, the media firestorm, the sheer number of people who had rallied behind him. Logan listened quietly, his gaze fixed outside the window, taking in the neighborhood he had nearly lost. When we finally turned onto his street, he let out a sharp breath. The driveway was filled with neighbors, friends, and even people he didn't know, all gathered to welcome him home. Flags waved, homemade signs covered the lawn, and a banner stretched across his porch with the words, "Welcome home, Logan." I glanced at him, half expecting him to be overwhelmed, but instead, he just shook his head in disbelief. He stepped out of the car, and within seconds, people surrounded him, shaking his hand, clapping him on the back, thanking him for his service. Some of the veterans in the neighborhood stood off to the side, offering silent salutes, a gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. As Logan made his way through the crowd, he stopped at the porch, running a hand over the railing as if confirming it was real. He turned to me, his voice low but steady, asking if everything was really over. I nodded, telling him that his house was safe, that the HOA was in shambles, and that Samantha Turner was facing legal consequences for everything she had done. For the first time since he had landed, I saw him truly relax. He took a deep breath, stepping inside his home, his fingers brushing against the doorframe. I followed him in, watching as he walked through each room, taking it all in. The furniture had been rearranged, the walls repainted, but it was still his home. The sense of loss that had once lingered was gone, replaced with something stronger: justice, victory, and the undeniable truth that he had won. That night, we sat on the porch as the last of the neighbors left, the air filled with the distant hum of cicadas. Logan leaned back in his chair, staring up at the sky, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, with a quiet chuckle, he muttered that he never expected to come home to a full-blown legal war. I laughed, shaking my head, telling him that he owed me for the stress. He smirked, saying he would make it up to me someday. And in that moment, I realized that despite everything, despite the months of chaos, corruption, and uncertainty, we had won. Not just against the HOA, not just for Logan's house, but for every person who had ever been wronged by people who thought they were above the law. The battle was over, but the impact of what we had done would last forever. The weeks following Logan's return felt surreal. The HOA, once a feared entity in the neighborhood, had collapsed under the weight of its corruption. Samantha Turner, once untouchable, was now facing multiple lawsuits and potential criminal charges. The rest of the HOA board had either resigned or disappeared, trying to avoid the fallout, but it was too late. The state had stepped in, launching an official investigation into not just our case, but every foreclosure the HOA had processed in the past 5 years. More homeowners came forward, sharing their own stories of intimidation, unfair fines, and sudden foreclosures that had forced them from their homes. Logan's case had set off a chain reaction, and the legal system was finally holding these people accountable. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had transformed. The fear that had once loomed over homeowners was gone, replaced with a newfound sense of unity. A new HOA was formed, this time led by residents who valued transparency and fairness. Monthly meetings were held where people could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak up were now actively involved, ensuring that nothing like this could ever happen again. But for Logan, the real victory wasn't just getting his house back. It was the overwhelming support he had received from people all over the country. Veterans, active duty soldiers, and even complete strangers had reached out, sharing their outrage and standing with him through it all. He had gone from being a victim of a corrupt system to a symbol of resilience, and though he never sought the attention, he appreciated knowing that his story had made a difference. As for Samantha, the last we heard, she had left town, her reputation in ruins. No matter where she went, the internet had made sure that her name would always be associated with one of the most egregious HOA scandals in history. She had built her career on control and power, but in the end, both had been stripped away, leaving her with nothing. Logan and I never spoke about her much after that. She wasn't worth the energy. Instead, we focused on moving forward. Logan took some time off to settle back into civilian life, reconnecting with old friends, and spending time with our mother, who had been waiting anxiously for him to come home. As for me, the entire experience had changed something inside me. I had fought for Logan, but in the process, I had learned just how many people had suffered in silence, powerless against the corruption of HOAs that had too much unchecked authority. I started looking into advocacy work, connecting with organizations that help military families fight legal battles just like the one we had won. Adrian, ever the bulldog, encouraged me to take it seriously, saying I had a knack for exposing fraud and injustice. I wasn't sure where it would lead me, but I knew one thing. I was never going to let something like this happen to anyone else without a fight. One evening, as Logan and I sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood he had nearly lost, he turned to me and smirked, saying that if I ever needed a place to crash, his door was always open. I laughed, shaking my head, realizing that despite everything, some things never changed. Logan was home, justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt right again. When my cousin Daniel was deployed overseas, our power-hungry HOA president, Laura Benson, saw the perfect opportunity to seize his historic family home. She had been waiting for the right moment, and with him out of the way, she made her move. That morning, I spotted her outside, circling his property like a vulture, phone in hand, documenting what she would later call violations. Laura stood there in her designer workout clothes, tapping away on her screen, the same hands that had approved her husband's construction contracts now recording every tiny detail of Daniel's home. I stepped outside, gripping my coffee as I watched her, knowing something wasn't right. "Excuse me, Laura, what exactly are you doing?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible, though my gut told me she wasn't here for anything good. Her fake smile barely masked the satisfaction in her eyes. "Just noting some serious maintenance issues," she replied smoothly, gesturing toward the house. The paint is at least 2 shades off from the approved HOA color palette, and those hedges. She pointed at the ones Daniel's daughter and I had trimmed every weekend, are clearly half an inch over regulation height. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around my cup. Daniel is literally overseas serving this country, Laura, and this house has been in his family for generations. The previous board approved that paint color 3 years ago. She barely glanced up from her phone. Rules change, she said casually, and deployment isn't an excuse for neglecting property values. Then she typed something else into her phone, and my stomach churned. It was the first time I realized that this wasn't about minor HOA rules. It was something bigger, something planned. Over the years, I had watched Laura do this before. The last 3 homeowners who challenged her authority had mysteriously ended up with liens on their properties. Now it was Daniel's turn. That afternoon, I started digging. I combed through every HOA document I could find, flipping through past meeting minutes. And there it was, a proposal buried in last month's notes. A new state-of-the-art community center was set to be built, right in the middle of our street, right where Daniel's house stood. The next week was a blur of certified letters arriving at his doorstep, each one citing a ridiculous new violation. The antique brass knocker, which had survived 2 world wars, was suddenly deemed non-compliant. The rose bushes his daughter had planted before his deployment were now considered invasive species. I tried calling Daniel, but military communications were restricted, and all I could do was send emails, hoping he would receive them in time. More and more board members began driving by the house, slowing down as they passed, jotting notes in their little notebooks. I installed security cameras after I caught Laura's husband measuring the property line at midnight with a flashlight. But the final straw was when I saw Laura leading a group of men in suits on a tour of our street. I followed quietly, heart pounding as I overheard her say, "This entire area will be transformed. The outdated structures will be removed, starting with that one." She pointed directly at Daniel's house. That night, I called his daughter, Emily, who was away at college. "Something's wrong," I told her, keeping my voice low. "I think they're planning something big, and your dad's deployment makes his house an easy target." "But Dad is supposed to be home in 2 weeks," she said, her voice shaking. "They can't just take our house, right?" I wanted to tell her it would be fine, that it was just a misunderstanding, but I knew better. Laura had already survived multiple lawsuits from other homeowners. She knew exactly how to work the system. I hung up the phone, dread settling deep in my bones. Then came the final blow. A certified letter arrived. An emergency HOA meeting had been called for tomorrow night. They were voting on the community center proposal, and the fine print made my blood run cold. The meeting was scheduled exactly 13 days before Daniel's return, 1 day short of the required notice for deployed service members under federal law. Laura had done her homework. She had planned this for months. That night, I locked Daniel's front door, unable to shake the feeling that these might be the last few hours this house would still belong to our family. On the wall, a photo of Daniel receiving his first command caught my eye. He had always told me that battles were won with strategy, not just strength. As I walked home, Laura's porch light snapped on. She stood in her doorway, wrapped in a silk robe, watching me with that same cold, glass-cutting smile. "Better take pictures," she called out sweetly, "for the memories." The night before everything changed, I barely slept. I sat in my living room, the dim glow of my laptop illuminating page after page of legal documents, searching for anything that could stop what was coming. But deep down, I already knew the decision had been made. The HOA had pushed their vote through, and Daniel's home was marked for demolition at sunrise. Outside, the neighborhood was eerily quiet, but I could feel something shifting, like the air was holding its breath. Every so often, I would glance out the window, half expecting to see Laura standing there, watching, waiting. I wasn't far off. At around midnight, I heard the faint sound of voices outside. I moved to the window cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. A small group of people stood near the HOA office across the street, their silhouettes barely visible under the streetlights. Laura was among them, speaking in hushed tones with a few board members and a man in a suit who I didn't recognize. They were shaking hands. My stomach twisted. I already knew what that meant. The final deal had been sealed. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my calls. Still nothing from Daniel. Still no word from his lawyer. I tried calling again, but like every other time, it went straight to voicemail. I gritted my teeth. I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. I had to warn someone. I dialed Emily's number. She answered on the first ring. Did they vote? Her voice was tense, breathless. I hesitated, hating what I had to say. It's done, Emily. They held the meeting early. They pushed it through. She was silent for a long moment. But Dad's supposed to be back in. I know, I cut in. But they planned this. They made sure the demolition would happen before he got back. There was another pause, then a sharp intake of breath. They can't do this. It's illegal. It doesn't matter to them, I said, staring out at the street where Laura and the others were still talking. They know exactly what they're doing. They're counting on the fact that by the time anyone challenges it, the house will already be gone. Emily's voice wavered. All our family pictures are there. My mom's garden. Everything. I closed my eyes. I wanted to promise her that I would stop it, that I would make sure her father's home was still standing when he returned. But I couldn't lie to her. Laura had orchestrated this down to the last minute. She had covered every loophole, ensured that there was no time left to fight back. The HOA had the permits. They had the legal paperwork. They had already paid the demolition crew. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my throat tightening. She sniffed, trying to hold back tears. We have to try something. Anything. I wanted to tell her I would fix it, that I could make it right. But before I could answer, something outside caught my eye. A large truck turned onto our street, its headlights cutting through the night. I stepped closer to the window, my pulse quickening. The truck slowed as it approached Daniel's house. And then another appeared behind it. And another. I felt the air leave my lungs. They were already setting up. The demolition team was here. They weren't even waiting for morning. My hands shook as I grabbed my jacket and ran to the door. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for sure. Laura had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The sound of heavy machinery shattered the early morning silence, jolting me awake before the sun had even fully risen. My heart pounded as I threw off the blankets and ran to the window, barely able to believe what I was seeing. 3 massive yellow bulldozers rumbled down the street, their engines roaring, their massive claws raised like predatory beasts moving in for the kill. Behind them, a large dump truck followed, ready to collect the remains of what had once been a historic family home. My stomach turned. They weren't waiting for an official go-ahead. They weren't giving us time to fight. They were doing it now. I grabbed the folder of legal documents I had spent the entire night reviewing and sprinted out the door, my bare feet barely registering the cold pavement as I ran toward Daniel's house. The morning fog hadn't even lifted, but there she was, Laura, standing off to the side, her signature smug expression firmly in place, dressed in her usual designer workout gear, as if this was just another day for her. She was tapping away on her iPad, not even looking up as I charged toward her, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Stop!" I yelled, holding up the stack of papers in my hands. "This house belongs to an active-duty service member. You can't do this." My voice came out sharper than I expected, a mixture of rage and desperation. Laura finally looked up, her eyes scanning me with a look of mild amusement. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, not even bothering to hide the condescension in her tone. "We had an emergency meeting last night. The board voted unanimously. The demolition is perfectly legal." My hands were shaking as I shoved the papers toward her, but she barely glanced at them. "We even have a city inspector's report," she added smoothly, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. The structure was deemed unsafe. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. "What inspector? I've been here every single day." Laura smiled, and that's when I saw it, the absolute certainty in her eyes that she had already won. The bulldozer operator hesitated, looking between me and Laura, clearly uncomfortable. I turned to him, pleading, "Please don't do this. The owner is an active-duty soldier. This is his home." The operator shifted his weight, his fingers twitching near the controls. He wasn't heartless, but he wasn't in charge either. My hands clenched around the legal papers as I desperately pulled out my phone. My only hope now was Daniel's lawyer. I hit dial, pacing back and forth as the phone rang. each second feeling like an eternity. Pick up, pick up, pick up. It went straight to voicemail. My pulse roared in my ears as I turned back toward the house. The first bulldozer rolled forward, its massive steel claw hovering over the front porch. The same porch where Daniel and I had sat drinking lemonade on summer afternoons. The same porch where his daughter had learned to read. The same porch where his wife had spent her final days. I opened my mouth to scream, to beg, to do anything, but the sickening crunch of wood splitting apart drowned out everything. The bulldozer had taken its first bite out of Daniel's home. Laura was already on her phone, her voice cool and casual. Yes, it's starting now. Make sure the crew is ready to break ground for the new community center next week. Don't worry about the permits. I got it all handled. The roar of the machinery swallowed the rest of her words. I stood there, frozen, as I watched my cousin's life being ripped apart in front of me, praying he would make it in time. The roar of the bulldozer was deafening. But then, without warning, it stopped. A strange, uneasy silence settled over the street, as if the entire world had suddenly held its breath. The operator froze, his hand hovering over the controls, his expression shifting from uncertainty to pure dread. I didn't understand why, until I turned and saw him. Daniel had arrived. He stood beside a black SUV, the early morning sunlight reflecting off his sharply pressed military uniform, the insignia on his chest unmistakable. The usually quiet street seemed to shrink under his presence. Every pair of eyes turned toward him, but he didn't react to the attention. He simply stood there, composed, unreadable, his gaze locked onto what remained of his home. Laura, who had been mid-sentence on her phone, suddenly faltered. Her confident smirk wavered for the first time since this nightmare had begun. I watched as she swallowed hard, adjusting her stance like someone realizing too late that they had stepped into a battlefield they weren't prepared for. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't shout. He simply started walking toward the rubble, his polished dress shoes crunching over shattered wood and broken glass. I followed, my breath catching in my throat. I had never seen him like this before, so calm, yet so dangerously quiet. As he approached what used to be his front porch, he knelt down, brushing away debris with a steady hand. And then he found it. Half buried under the wreckage, a small, gold-plated object glinted in the sunlight. His daughter's first ballet trophy. The delicate figurine had snapped in half, its tiny dancer barely clinging to the base. Daniel picked it up with a level of care that made my chest tighten. He didn't move for a long moment, just staring at it, the weight of everything sinking in. The silence stretched on. Even Laura, for all her arrogance, didn't dare speak first. Then finally he stood. He turned to face Laura, his posture as straight and composed as ever, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something cold, something calculating. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, his voice controlled, but with an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. "I believe you're standing on my property." Laura hesitated, gripping the HOA papers in her manicured hands, as if they were a shield. The board's decision was unanimous, general. Everything was handled legally. Daniel held up a single hand, and she fell silent mid-sentence like a soldier caught out of line. Without another word, he reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out his phone. He pressed a single number on speed dial, lifted it to his ear, and waited. The air around us thickened with anticipation. Whoever was on the other end of that call, it was clear that they were about to become Laura's biggest nightmare. Daniel stood motionless, phone pressed to his ear, his expression unreadable as the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Laura shifted uneasily, gripping her clipboard tighter, her confidence flickering like a candle in the wind. The other board members, who had been standing at a distance, started exchanging nervous glances, sensing that whatever was happening wasn't in their favor. Then Daniel spoke, his voice calm, steady, and carrying the weight of someone who had commanded entire battlefields. "Bill, I think your committee would be very interested in what I'm looking at right now." Laura flinched at the name. The color drained from her face. Even the bulldozer operator, who had been frozen with his hands near the controls, slowly backed away from the machine, as if trying to distance himself from whatever was unfolding. Daniel listened for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Yes, that property, the one my grandfather willed to me. the one that was protected under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. His words landed like hammer blows, each one stripping another layer of Laura's carefully built defense. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. Daniel continued, his voice unwavering. Yes, Senator Williams, I do believe your office should be involved, and perhaps the local news as well. A low murmur rippled through the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered, their phones now raised, recording every second. Laura's breath hitched audibly. Her polished confidence was gone. In its place was something else, pure, unfiltered panic. She turned sharply, whispering frantically into her own phone, her hands shaking now as she scrolled through her contacts, desperate to reach someone who could undo the mess she had just walked into. But there was no undoing this. Daniel lowered his phone, slipping it back into his pocket with the same measured control he had displayed since arriving. His gaze locked onto Laura, and he took a single step forward. She stepped back. It wasn't a spoken threat. It didn't have to be. The balance of power had shifted entirely. The woman who had bulldozed homes, intimidated residents, and manipulated the system was now the one on unstable ground. This isn't over, she muttered under her breath, trying to convince herself more than anyone else. But Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged. No, it isn't. His tone was final, unshaken. The real fight had just begun. The moment Daniel put his phone away, the street was no longer just a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a battlefield. Word spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had been silently watching from behind their curtains began stepping outside, phones in hand, whispering among themselves. Within minutes, a local news van pulled up at the end of the block, followed by another. Laura's breath came quicker now, her fingers tapping frantically on her phone screen as she called someone, anyone, to help contain the situation. But it was already spiraling beyond her control. Daniel remained composed, his eyes scanning what was left of his home, but the weight of the destruction settled in his shoulders. He knelt down again, this time lifting a charred photo frame from the rubble. The glass was shattered, the picture inside partially burned, but it was still clear enough to see. His late wife smiling back at him, their daughter barely 5 years old, perched on his shoulders. His grip tightened on the frame, but his face gave nothing away. Laura saw it too, and for a brief moment, she hesitated as if realizing the full extent of what she had done. But she recovered quickly, straightening her back and turning toward the news crews. This was a simple misunderstanding, she declared loudly, her voice forced and brittle. The board acted in the best interest of the community. We followed all proper protocols. This was a legal action. The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder. Some nodded, clearly still afraid of crossing the HOA, but others shook their heads, exchanging looks of disbelief. And then a new voice cut through the tension. That's not what you said last night. The crowd turned as a young woman stepped forward from the sidewalk. It was Sarah Carter, a resident 3 doors down, someone who had always been too afraid to speak up at HOA meetings. She was gripping her phone, so tightly her knuckles were white. I heard you on the phone, Mrs. Benson, she continued, her voice trembling but determined. You said the demolition had to be done before he got back. You knew what you were doing. Laura's face went pale, but Sarah wasn't done. She held up her phone. I recorded everything. A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Even Daniel raised an eyebrow, watching Laura's reaction closely. For the first time since this started, she looked genuinely afraid. Laura's mouth opened and closed as if searching for the right words, but for the first time, nothing came out. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were openly talking, exchanging shocked glances. Some of the HOA board members took a quiet step back, distancing themselves from her, their expressions shifting from arrogance to unease. That recording is fake, Laura finally blurted, her voice higher than before, her confidence cracking. This is an attempt to slander the board. But even as she said it, her hands trembled, and everyone could see the panic rising in her eyes. Daniel still hadn't spoken. He was standing just behind Sarah, watching Laura unravel, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to argue. He didn't need to justify himself. He just had to wait, and Laura was doing all the damage on her own. One of the board members, a man named Richard, who had always been one of Laura's strongest supporters, cleared his throat and took a cautious step forward. "Maybe we should take a moment to know," Laura snapped, spinning to face him. "We need to handle this before it gets out of control." But it was already too late. The flashing lights of a police cruiser appeared at the end of the block, moving slowly toward the scene. Laura turned, her entire body stiffening as the officers stepped out of the vehicle. One of them, an older officer with sharp eyes, scanned the area before settling his gaze on Daniel. "General," he greeted, his tone respectful, as if he already knew who he was. Daniel gave him a slow nod before finally speaking. "I'd like to file a formal complaint," he said, his voice smooth, unwavering. "Against the HOA, against this woman, and against anyone involved in the illegal demolition of my home. I want charges pressed for fraud, unauthorized destruction of property, and violations under the Service Members Civil Relief Act." A hushed silence fell over the crowd. Laura's breathing turned shallow, her grip tightening on the clipboard she was still holding, as if it could shield her from what was coming next. Daniel's tone didn't change, but the weight of his words was enough to make everyone around them straighten. The officer pulled out a notepad. "Understood, sir. Let's take this inside and go over the details." Laura took a shaky step forward. "There's no need for this," she tried to say, her voice losing its edge. "We can sort this out," but Daniel didn't even look at her. He had already turned, walking toward the police vehicle with the officer, the conversation shifting away from her, as if she no longer mattered. For the first time, she understood what that meant. This wasn't her game anymore. She had just lost control. The police officers moved quickly, their radios crackling as they started collecting statements, flipping through legal documents, and photographing the destruction of Daniel's home. The neighbors, emboldened by Daniel's presence, stepped forward one by one, their voices filled with anger and relief. This wasn't just about one house anymore. Laura had been running the HOA like her own personal empire for years, and now, with cameras rolling and officers taking notes, her world was crumbling. Still, she wasn't ready to let go. She straightened her back, lifting her chin, desperately trying to hold on to the authority that had once commanded fear. "This is all a mistake," she snapped, her voice sharp and forced. "The board agreed to this. The community agreed to this. We followed procedure." But the murmurs around her only grew louder. Someone scoffed. Someone else muttered "liar" under their breath. Laura turned on them, eyes flashing. "You all signed the petitions. You all wanted improvements. Don't act like this wasn't for the benefit of the neighborhood." That was the final straw. One of the board members, Richard, the same man who had been her most loyal supporter just an hour ago, stepped forward, shaking his head. "That's not what happened, Laura." His voice was steady, but the shift in tone was clear. He was done covering for her. "You manipulated us. You pushed votes through without proper notice. You altered HOA records." More voices joined in, former allies now eager to distance themselves from the fallout. "You misused funds. You ignored legal complaints. You threatened homeowners." Laura spun in place, looking at the people she had once controlled, her composure cracking like glass. That's when one of the officers, the one who had spoken to Daniel, stepped forward, holding up a stack of freshly printed documents. "We pulled these from city records," he said, flipping through the pages. "You filed fraudulent property violations to justify this demolition. You also pushed through construction permits without full approval." His voice darkened as he looked up. "And you're already under investigation for similar cases in 2 other neighborhoods." The color drained from Laura's face. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. This wasn't just one mistake. This was a pattern, and now it was all catching up to her. Daniel, still standing near the wreckage of his home, didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The law was finally working in his favor, and Laura knew it. One of the officers pulled out a small notepad. "We'll be conducting a full investigation, but based on what we've gathered so far, I'd advise you to get legal representation." Laura's breath hitched. For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. Laura stood frozen, her face pale, her perfectly calculated world unraveling before her eyes. The neighbor she had once ruled over now whispered openly, some recording, others already calling for her removal from the HOA board. The officers continued their work, taking more statements, collecting more evidence. One by one, the remaining board members backed away, some muttering weak excuses about how they had been misled, while others simply walked off, knowing the storm had only just begun. The HOA was crumbling from the inside, and Laura had no allies left. Richard, the board member who had once defended her, turned to an officer. "I'd like to formally resign from the board," he said, his voice tight. "I had no idea the extent of this corruption, and I won't be part of it." He wasn't the only one. Within minutes, 3 more board members followed suit, throwing Laura under the bus to save themselves. She looked around, her breathing shallow, the weight of her downfall crashing down on her. She had spent years manipulating people, twisting the rules, making herself untouchable. But now, all she could do was watch as the very system she had abused finally turned against her. The officer in charge gave a final nod and closed his notepad. "We'll be moving forward with an investigation," he said. "I suggest you prepare yourself for legal proceedings, Mrs. Benson." Laura opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. Daniel, who had remained calm through it all, finally took a step forward. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to threaten her. He simply looked at her, his eyes steady, his posture unwavering. "You thought this was just about a house," he said, his voice dangerously smooth. "But this was about much more than that. You tried to take everything from me, from my family. Now, you get to see what it feels like." The silence that followed was deafening. Laura flinched but said nothing. She knew she had lost. The last shred of her power was gone. A few feet away, neighbors murmured among themselves. Someone mentioned a community vote to remove Laura from the HOA permanently. Someone else whispered about how they should have spoken up sooner. It didn't matter now. The damage was done. Daniel turned away from her without another word, walking toward what remained of his home. The structure was gone, reduced to nothing but rubble. But he wasn't defeated. He had won the real battle. And Laura? She had just made the biggest mistake of her life.
I never thought that buying my dream home would turn into an absolute nightmare. When I first stepped into this house, I felt like I had finally made it. My own space, my own rules, my own peace. It was supposed to be my sanctuary. But I had no idea that someone else had already set their eyes on my property, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It all started with an innocent-looking letter, taped right to my front door. At first, I thought it was some neighborhood announcement, maybe an invitation to a community event. But as soon as I read the first few lines, my stomach dropped. "Dear homeowner, we are pleased to inform you that your property has been incorporated into the HOA district. As a member, you are now responsible for maintaining community standards and paying monthly fees. Failure to comply will result in penalties, including legal action." What the hell? I never signed up for an HOA. In fact, I specifically bought this house because it was outside of any HOA jurisdiction. No pointless rules, no random fees, no power-hungry board members trying to control my property. And yet, here I was holding a letter that basically said, "Congratulations. You're now part of an HOA whether you like it or not." At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe they had sent it to the wrong address. So, I did the most logical thing. I called the HOA office listed on the letter. The phone barely rang twice before a sickeningly sweet voice answered. "Homeowners Association office, this is Linda speaking. How can I assist you today?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my anger in check. "Yeah, I just got a letter saying my house is now part of the HOA. There must be some mistake. I never agreed to this." Silence. Then a calm but firm reply. "Oh, Mr. Reynolds, there's no mistake. Your property was annexed into our HOA as part of our recent community expansion. All new members are required to comply with the rules and pay their dues immediately." I gritted my teeth. "You can't just force me into an HOA. I never signed anything." Linda let out a soft, almost patronizing laugh. "Oh, Mr. Reynolds, refusing to comply won't make this go away. It would be in your best interest to cooperate. Otherwise, you might find yourself facing penalties." A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just about some stupid HOA rules. This was a threat. And I had just realized I was up against something much, much bigger than I had ever imagined. I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA force me into their ridiculous rules. If they thought I was going to roll over and start paying their fees like a good little homeowner, they had picked the wrong guy. I decided to get ahead of the situation and check the county records. If my house had never been under HOA jurisdiction, then legally they had no claim over me. I spent hours digging through property records, zoning laws, and anything else I could find. And just as I suspected, there was nothing linking my house to the HOA. No contracts, no agreements, no clauses in my deed. Armed with this information, I drove straight to their office. I wanted to see the person who had the audacity to claim my property as theirs. The receptionist barely looked up as I approached the front desk. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that made it clear she didn't actually care. "I need to speak with someone in charge." "Now," I said, dropping the printed records on the desk. She sighed and pressed a button on her phone. A moment later, the office door swung open and in walked him. James Carter, the HOA president. He was exactly what I expected, middle-aged, wearing an overpriced suit, and radiating the kind of arrogance that only comes from years of unchecked power. He smiled like a man who was used to getting his way. "Ah, Mr. Reynolds," he said as if we were old friends. "I was wondering when you'd stop by." I slid the paperwork toward him. "This says my house was never part of the HOA. You have no legal right to charge me anything." Carter barely glanced at the documents before sliding them back toward me. "Things change," he said smoothly. "You'll find that our bylaws allow for community expansion. Your house has been annexed." "That's illegal," I snapped. He let out a small chuckle. "That's a strong word. But let me explain something to you, Mr. Reynolds. The HOA always wins. Homeowners like you, well, they either comply or they leave." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. I walked out of that office, furious but determined. I wasn't going to back down. But when I got home, I realized just how serious they were. A bright orange violation notice was taped to my front door. In bold letters it read, "Violation Notice, Failure to Comply with HOA Regulations." Below that was a list of supposed infractions. Lawn not trimmed to HOA standards. Trash bins visible from the street. Unauthorized modifications to property. I clenched my fist. This was pure harassment. And I knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. If they thought a few fake violations were going to scare me into compliance, they were dead wrong. But as I would soon realize, the HOA wasn't playing fair. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of loud voices outside. I stepped onto my porch and felt my stomach twist. A small group of people stood at the edge of my driveway. At the center was James Carter, flanked by 2 board members and a clipboard-wielding woman who looked like she lived for paperwork. "Mr. Reynolds," Carter said, flashing that same smug smile. "We're here to conduct an inspection of your property. HOA policy requires all homes to meet community standards." I crossed my arms. "You don't have jurisdiction over my house. This is private property." The clipboard woman spoke up, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "According to the new HOA expansion, your home is now subject to our guidelines. If we find violations, we'll have to issue fines." I clenched my jaw. "You can issue all the fines you want. You don't have the legal right to enforce them." Carter's smile wavered just a little. "We'll see about that," he said before waving his group forward. I had 2 choices, stand my ground or let them walk all over me. So I did what any sane person would do. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "I need you all to leave my property," I said, my camera capturing every smug expression and power-hungry glance. Carter's face tightened. "Sir, this isn't necessary." "Actually, it is," I cut him off. "You're trespassing. If you don't leave, I'll call the police." There was a long, tense silence. Then, without another word, Carter turned on his heel and stormed off, his little entourage scurrying after him. I had won this round. But I knew this was far from over. That night, I installed security cameras around my house. If the HOA wanted a fight, I was going to be prepared. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. Because the very next morning, I woke up to something much, much worse. I barely got any sleep that night. Even though I had sent Carter and his minions packing, something about the way he had said, "We'll see about that," stuck with me. It wasn't over. And I was right. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab my mail, and my heart nearly stopped. A bright red tow notice was slapped onto my truck's windshield. I ripped it off and read the fine print. "Unauthorized vehicle parked in a non-designated area. Vehicle will be towed within 24 hours unless compliant with HOA parking regulations." My own driveway. They were trying to tow my truck from my own damn driveway. My blood boiled. This wasn't just harassment anymore, this was an all-out attack. Before I could even process my anger, I heard a loud clang from across the street. I turned just in time to see a construction crew unloading metal poles and fencing panels right onto my lawn. "What the hell? Hey?" I shouted, storming toward them. "What do you think you're doing?" One of the workers barely glanced at me. "We're installing a community perimeter fence, sir." "HOA orders?" I spun around and saw him standing at the sidewalk, James Carter. Arms crossed, smirk in place, watching like a man who knew he was untouchable. "This isn't community property," I yelled. "You can't build anything here." Carter smirked. "Actually, under the revised HOA bylaws, this land has been reassigned for the beautification of the neighborhood." I felt my fist clench. "This is my land. I own this house. You can't just take my property." "We can and we have," Carter said smoothly. "You'll find the paperwork in your mailbox." I turned and sprinted to my mailbox. Sure enough, there was another legal-looking document inside. I scanned through it, my pulse hammering. They were trying to claim my front yard under some nonsense community improvement initiative. It was pure, calculated theft. I turned back to the crew and shouted, "Touch one thing on my property, and I'll have you arrested for trespassing." The workers hesitated, looking uncertain. Carter's smirk faltered for just a second. Then, with a dramatic sigh, he said, "You're being unreasonable, Mr. Reynolds. This is a community decision." "No," I shot back. "This is my decision. And I decide that if any of you step foot on my property again, you'll be dealing with the police." The workers glanced at Carter, clearly waiting for direction. He pursed his lips, then finally waved them off. "Fine," he said. "Have it your way. But this is far from over." I should have known that wasn't an empty threat. Because 2 days later, I came home to find a bright yellow notice taped to my front door. And this time they weren't just coming after my yard. They were coming after my entire house. 2 days passed without any sign of the HOA. No unannounced inspections, no fake violations, just silence. It was almost too quiet. I knew they were up to something, but I had no idea just how bad it would be. Then one evening I came home and saw it. A bright yellow notice plastered across my front door. The bold, capitalized words made my stomach turn. "Final notice, property non-compliant, action required immediately." I ripped it down and scanned the details. Unapproved exterior modifications? What modifications? Failure to submit HOA membership dues? I wasn't even a member. Continued violation of community guidelines? Which ones? At the bottom, in bold print, was the real bombshell. Failure to comply will result in legal action, including but not limited to property liens, fines, and potential forced compliance measures. They weren't just trying to fine me anymore. They were trying to take my house. A mix of rage and panic set in. I had been fighting this battle for weeks, but now they were escalating to legal warfare. I needed a plan. I rushed inside and called my lawyer. The moment he picked up, I read the notice to him. There was a long pause before he finally sighed. "This isn't new," he said. "I've seen HOAs try this before. They bank on homeowners giving up before things get serious. But they don't have a legal claim to your property, not unless they can prove you signed an agreement." "So what do?" I asked. "We fight back," he said firmly. "First, we file a formal dispute with the city. Second, we demand proof of their authority over your property. And third," he paused, "we go public." I frowned. "Public?" "Yes," he said. "HOAs hate bad press. If you expose their illegal tactics, they'll fold faster than you think." It made sense. These people thrived on control and secrecy. If the entire neighborhood found out what they were doing, they'd be in serious trouble. That night I got to work. I gathered every single piece of evidence I had. The original deed proving my home was never in the HOA. All letters and violation notices they had sent me. Video footage of Carter and his goons trespassing on my property. Then I started making calls. First, the local news station. Second, a community lawyer who had experience fighting corrupt HOAs. And third, my neighbors. Because if the HOA thought they could bully me into submission, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. But what I didn't know, the HOA was about to make their boldest move yet. And this time it wasn't just legal threats. They were about to physically take something from me. I knew the HOA was desperate, but I never expected them to take things this far. The next morning, I woke up early, ready to put my plan into action. I was going to war. The documents were prepared, my lawyer was on board, and I had already sent emails to the local news. But when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. Something was missing. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing, or rather what I wasn't seeing. My truck. It was gone. I rushed to my driveway, my heart pounding. No broken glass. No signs of forced entry. It hadn't been stolen, it had been towed. I spotted a neon green sign planted in the grass where my truck had been parked. This area has been designated a no parking zone per HOA regulations. Unauthorized vehicles have been removed at the owner's expense. They towed my truck from my own driveway. I was seeing red. I whipped out my phone and dialed the towing company listed on the sign. "Yes, we have your vehicle," the woman on the other end said casually. "It was impounded under HOA request. You'll need to pay the fee to get it back." I clenched my jaw. "How much?" She barely hesitated. $750. $750. For my own truck. Taken from my own driveway. I was fuming. But I wasn't about to let them win. I drove straight to the tow lot, paid the ridiculous fee and got my truck back. But as I pulled out, I knew this was their way of showing me that they could take whatever they wanted. I needed to strike back. Art. When I got home, I turned on my computer and started typing. Post title: "My HOA is illegally trying to take my property, here's the proof." I uploaded every single violation notice, the towing fee receipt, the video of Carter trespassing on my property. I tagged the news stations. I posted it everywhere. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. Because within hours my post exploded. Comments poured in. People were furious. Some were neighbors who had been harassed by the HOA too. Others were complete strangers who just wanted to see the HOA burn. The pressure was building. But before I could celebrate, something happened that made my blood run cold. A black SUV pulled up to my house. And out stepped James Carter. But this time he wasn't alone. He had brought the police. I stood frozen on my front porch as James Carter stepped out of the black SUV, his smug expression barely hiding the fact that he thought he had already won. 2 uniformed police officers followed him, their faces unreadable. This wasn't just another intimidation tactic. Carter was playing dirty. "Mr. Reynolds," he called out, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "We need to have a word." I squared my shoulders, refusing to let him see that I was rattled. "If it's about your HOA's illegal harassment, my lawyer will be handling it." Carter let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as if I was some naive fool. "Oh, this isn't about the HO. This is about you." One of the officers stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Sir, we received a report about an aggressive homeowner making threats against HOA board members. Mr. Carter has expressed concerns for his safety." My jaw dropped. "Are you kidding me?" Carter folded his arms, pretending to look concerned. "Mr. Reynolds, your behavior has been escalating. First, you refuse to follow community guidelines, then you post defamatory statements online, and now, well, I had no choice but to involve the authorities." I could feel my blood boiling. This was a setup. "Officer," I said, keeping my voice as level as possible. "I have video proof of Carter and his team trespassing on my property. I have legal documents that show my house is not under HOA control. And now, after I expose them, they magically call you claiming I'm a threat." The officers exchanged glances. One of them spoke up, "Do you have this proof readily available?" Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone, opening the footage of Carter's inspection where he tried to claim my yard as HOA property. I scrolled to the towing receipt, the fraudulent violation notices, and finally, the viral post that had thousands of comments calling out the HOA's corruption. The officers watched in silence. Then one of them turned to Carter. "Sir, none of this matches the report you gave us." Carter's smug expression twitched. I took a step forward. "You just tried to file a false police report to intimidate me. That's a crime, isn't it?" The first officer turned back to Carter, his eyes narrowing. "Sir, we take false reports very seriously. Are you sure you want to proceed with this complaint?" Carter's face turned red. He clenched his jaw, realizing he had overplayed his hand. Finally, he forced a smile. "You know, I think this might have been a misunderstanding." I couldn't help but smirk. For the first time he looked nervous. The officers gave him a final warning before walking back to their patrol car. Carter had just tried to use the police to scare me, and it backfired spectacularly. But the battle wasn't over. Because that night something far worse happened. I thought I had won that round. Carter had been humiliated, his attempt to use the police backfiring right in his face. But I should have known better. Desperate people do desperate things. That night, I was jolted awake by the sound of metal scraping against pavement. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then, a loud thud. I shot out of bed and ran to the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. A tow truck. And it wasn't just any tow truck, it was parked in my driveway. I grabbed my phone and bolted outside, heart pounding in my chest. The truck's hook was already attached to my vehicle. They were trying to steal my truck again. "Hey!" I yelled, storming toward them. Get off my property. The driver barely flinched, looking back at me with zero concern. Just following HOA orders, he said, as if that was supposed to mean something. You can't tow a vehicle from private property, I snapped, pulling out my phone. I'm calling the cops. The driver hesitated. He glanced back at someone standing in the shadows. And that's when I saw him. James Carter. Standing just beyond the streetlight, arms crossed, watching. Like a damn vulture waiting for its prey to drop dead. You're making a mistake, Mr. Reynolds, he called out. Just let it go. Sign the HOA agreement, and all of this stops. I had never been more furious in my life. He was openly threatening me right in front of my house in the middle of the night. You have 5 seconds to get off my property, I said, stepping closer. Or you'll be explaining all of this to the police. The tow truck driver looked nervous now. Carter, however, just smiled. You don't want to go to war with me, Reynolds? You have no idea who you're dealing with? But I wasn't scared anymore. I was done playing defense. I raised my phone higher. Then let's make this official. You're trespassing. You ordered an illegal tow. You just threatened me on camera. For the first time, Carter's smirk faded. The tow truck driver suddenly let go of the controls, stepping back. I'm not getting paid enough for this, he muttered before hopping back into the truck and speeding away. Carter stood there, his face twisting with barely concealed rage. Big mistake, he hissed before disappearing into the darkness. And in that moment I knew, this had just gotten personal. But what I didn't know was that the HOA's next move would be their most dangerous one yet. I barely slept that night. Even after the tow truck was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. And I was right. The next morning I walked outside, my mind still replaying Carter's threat from the night before. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. My house had been vandalized. Spray painted across my garage door in huge red letters was a single word. Delinquent. I froze, my fists clenching as rage boiled inside me. These cowards had come in the middle of the night and vandalized my home. My neighbors were already out, whispering among themselves. Some looked shocked. Others just shook their heads as if I had somehow brought this on myself. But that wasn't even the worst part. A small crowd of HOA members stood at the end of my driveway. Carter was right there in the middle, his arms crossed, smirking like he had just won a battle. You've been officially marked as a problem homeowner, Mr. Reynolds, he called out loud enough for the entire street to hear. I turned to face him, my hands shaking, not with fear but with pure fury. You think this is going to scare me? I shouted. Carter shrugged. I think it's going to make your life a lot harder. The neighborhood is losing patience with you. They want peace, order. And you? Well, he gestured to my garage. You're just a delinquent now. I took a step toward him. This is illegal, Carter. You know it. And when I prove it, you're going to regret every single thing you've done. He smiled, but for the first time I saw something else in his expression. Doubt. Because he knew I wasn't going to back down. And he was right. I pulled out my phone and snapped pictures of everything. The vandalism, the crowd, Carter's smug face. Then I made a call. Hey, it's me. Yeah. I need that news crew here ASAP. Carter's smirk finally vanished. Because now, the whole world was about to see what this HOA was really doing. And their days of getting away with it were officially over. I had reached my breaking point. Enough was enough. By the time the local news crew arrived, my front yard was packed with neighbors, some curious, some whispering among themselves, and some, especially the HOA loyalists, visibly panicking. Good. Carter stood among them, arms crossed, his face tight with barely concealed rage. He knew what was happening. For the first time he was losing control. The reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand. Mr. Reynolds, can you explain to us what's happening here? I didn't hesitate. I turned toward the cameras, holding up my phone. I have proof that this HOA is illegally harassing homeowners. They vandalized my property. They tried to steal my vehicle, twice. They filed false police reports against me. And now they're trying to take my house under fake regulations. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the neighbors who had been ignoring the situation suddenly looked uneasy. I pointed directly at Carter. This man is leading it all. Carter scoffed, stepping forward, his fake calm demeanor starting to crack. That's a bold accusation, Mr. Reynolds. Do you have any real proof? Or is this just another stunt? I smiled. Oh, I have proof. I pulled out my laptop, turning it toward the news crew. Live on camera, I played the videos. Carter and his team trespassing on my property. The tow truck attempting to illegally take my truck, on camera. The false violation notices proven fake. The footage of my vandalized garage door, HOA members standing right there. Carter's smirk vanished. The reporter turned to him. "Mr. Carter, do you have a response to these allegations?" His face turned red. This is completely out of context." He turned to the crowd. "Mr. Reynolds has been disruptive, refusing to follow the community's rules. We were just enforcing order." A voice cut through the crowd. "Then why is my house getting the same treatment?" The entire street turned as another homeowner stepped forward, holding his own stack of HOA violation notices. Then another neighbor. And another. Suddenly it wasn't just about me. The HOA's corruption was being exposed, live on air. Carter knew it was over. His hands clenched into fists, his mouth opened and closed like he was searching for an escape. But there wasn't one. By the time the interview ended, the damage was done. The news station promised to investigate further. Social media was already exploding with the footage. And that night, HOA board members started resigning. One by one they distanced themselves from Carter. Because they knew what was coming next. A formal lawsuit. 3 weeks later, after my lawyer filed the case, the city launched an official investigation into the HOA. Carter? He was removed from his position, fined thousands of dollars for HOA fraud, and banned from ever holding another leadership role in any homeowners association. And as for my home? It remained mine. No fines. No liens. No harassment. I had one. And the HOA? They learned a lesson they'd never forget. Mess with the wrong homeowner and you'll pay the price.